So pleased to welcome you to this special event with Claire Bidwell Smith. Before we get started, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. We have over 16,000 people registered for this event, and I want to share a few ways for everyone to maximize their time today. The first item is the Q&A function. This will appear in your Zoom toolbar. We currently have it turned off, but it will turn on and back in a few minutes. Claire will do her best to answer your questions before the break and at the end of the session. The Q&A is for content-related questions for Claire only. If you see someone already asked the same question you have, please give that question a thumbs up in the chat. Now, if you've purchased the CE and book package, remember you must take action for the book to be shipped to you. You would have received an email within 24 hours after your purchase that included a link to enter your mailing address and claim your book. Lastly, there will be a 15-minute break. Claire will take that about halfway through, so keep that in mind. And okay, with that, I'm excited to introduce to you Claire Bidwell Smith. Claire is a renowned grief expert, a practicing therapist, and a critically acclaimed author of 4 books. It's an absolute pleasure to have her with us today. I know you're going to learn so much. With that, here's Claire Bidwell Smith.
Thank you so much, Carson. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am so honored to be here, excited to be here with all of you today. I cannot believe how many of you have signed up for this. Talk about anxiety. No, it's testament, I think, to how much we need to keep learning about grief and anxiety. I am going to share my screen here, and we will get started. Like Carson said, we're going to take a break about halfway through, and we are going to do some Q&A and answer questions a little bit before that halfway point, and then again before the end. I love hearing from you guys. It would be so nice to just kind of hear what's on your mind, what kind of questions you have coming up, and I will do my best to answer as many as I can. So today we're going to talk about anxious grief, and I just had a workbook come out through PESI all about that, which is really exciting. It looks like this. And we're going to talk about understanding anxious grief, drawing the connection and correlation between anxiety and grief, understand when anxiety is grief related, really break down anxiety, grief, and anxious grief. Talk about different models of grief, including the 5 stages and a lot of other models, and where anxiety fits in with those, and also talk about how long it lasts. And I really hope to give you also a lot of tools and ideas to use working with anxious grieving clients. There's a ton in the workbook, but we're also going to go through a lot of them today. I am Claire Bidwell Smith, LCPC. I have been a licensed therapist for over a decade. I specialize in grief. I have actually my 5th book is coming out in March. Anxious Grief was my 4th. They're all about grief, much to my children's chagrin. They're always like, oh, that's exciting that you have a new book coming out, Mom. What is it about? Grief again. So they're all about grief, but very different facets of it. My background story is that I was 14 years old when both of my parents got cancer at the same time. I was 18 when my mother died and 25 when my dad died. And it was this experience that really catapulted me into this work. I'll be talking a little bit about my personal experience, a lot about my professional experience over the course of today. I today live in Los Angeles. I run retreats, online workshops, support groups. I love sitting with people one-on-one. I love working with people who are grieving, stepping into their world for a little bit and trying to help them move along their path of grief. I've been doing this for a long time. I worked in hospice initially, and then I've been in private practice for a long time. I love working with up-and-coming practitioners, seasoned therapists, people who are just trying to help others in this realm. There's so much grief work needed out there. So I'm really heartened that there are so many of you here today. I want to start by just offering an invitation. I would love for you to kind of set aside any ideas you might have about grief, any ideas that have been put on you from your community or family or culturally, television, all kinds of things, and just open up to some new ways of thinking about grief today. I think that grief is, as this says, not an affliction. It is not something that we need to get over, rush through, fix. Grief is a very natural human process. It's something that we all experience throughout our lifetimes in many, many different ways. We begin experiencing grief as children, even when we lose stuffed animals, pets, go through changes in our home and family and community environments. We are always experiencing grief on some level in different ways. And I think it has taken a lot of time for our culture to really come around and start to open up to it. And so over the decades and centuries of grieving that's been going on, I think there's been a lot of mixed messages that people have been receiving. I would imagine that a lot of you who are clinicians have some more open, evolved understandings of grief. But when you're working with clients, they are coming in so often with a lot of confusion and a lot of misunderstanding. And I think one of the very first things that is really important to do is just normalize the grief process for them, help them open up to it, help it seem not so scary, really just give them the same invitation to bring their grief in and sit with it. And I really believe that the way that we truly heal through grief and grief-related anxiety is by leaning into it. Obviously, we can't do that without support. We really need to have some kind of support around us, whether it's family, community, a therapist, a grief support group. Sometimes we aren't safe enough to grieve. We don't have the resources enough to make that space and time that is really needed for grief. So today, just kind of opening up this invitation to imagine and think about and hold the space that grief is not a terrible thing. It is so deeply painful sometimes, a lot of the times. But within that pain, there is also a lot of opportunity for new ways to understand ourselves, understand the world, understand our relationships, the people that we have loved and lost. There are so many opportunities to really kind of think about life in a new way. Sometimes that's scary, hence the grief-related anxiety. But once you have really found a way to kind of hold space and work through that, there's some really beautiful opportunities for post-grief growth, post-traumatic growth. We're going to talk about all of that today. I have always looked back to this quote from C.S. Lewis talking about grief and fear from a very long time ago. And I will tell you guys a little bit about my own experience, but I do just want to start by talking a little bit about how the last 4 years have really changed what we're talking about today. Before the pandemic, we really weren't recognizing the connection of grief and anxiety. We really were afforded an opportunity to understand it in new ways over the last 4 years. With all the loss that's happened, all the change that has happened, all the anxiety that has occurred within our entire world over the last 4 years, new understandings have really risen to the surface about grief and anxiety. If I were teaching this course 4 years ago, 5 years ago, it would have been really different. I don't think people would have been able to understand it as well as we do today. And in some ways, that's a really amazing gift. It came at a terrible cost to so many people, but it also has really shifted our culture and our understanding of grief and anxiety immeasurably in really powerful ways. So again, today we're going to talk about how these two things are linked, why anxiety is a common symptom of grief, why this symptom is often overlooked, how it presents, and how we treat it. I'm going to begin a little bit, though, with my background. Again, I mentioned that my parents both got cancer at the same time when I was 14. This is my mom, Sally, and my dad, Jerry. I was an only child, and my father was diagnosed with prostate cancer. He was a bit older. It was common for someone his age, not too threatening. But shortly after his diagnosis, my mother found out that she had stage 4 colon cancer, and hers was very serious. My entire high school career was just consumed with their treatments. I was trying to be a normal high school kid, but at the same time, both of my parents were going through chemo and radiation and surgeries. And my mother was very sick on and off. There was a lot of touch and go moments, but we didn't talk about it that much. My parents were of the belief at the time that we should just kind of keep going on as though life were normal. And that's, I say that because we will talk about how that's one of the ways that anxiety can surface, is trying to pretend like things are normal when they aren't. And I knew that things were not normal underneath it, yet I was trying to just continue to soldier on like everybody else. And so I went off to college, and my freshman semester, my mother died. And it really dropped the floor out from underneath me. She and I had been incredibly close. She was a wonderful human being, full of a lot of light and magic and spontaneity and so much love. And because we had really never talked about how sick she was or how sick they both were, her death in some ways came as a surprise. I wasn't there the night she died. Again, not really taking it seriously that she was as gravely ill as she was. And I immediately was consumed with so much regret for not having been there, not being able to say goodbye to her. It was something that would really sit with me for a long time to come. And after her death, I was also very aware that my father was much older and he would probably not live to see me turn 30. And so my ensuing years after her death were consumed with anxiety. That was my predominant symptom. It started in the first year after she died. Panic attacks. I ended up in the ER. I had various forms of hypochondria, constantly fearing my own health, my body, worried that I was going to die at any moment. Anytime I talked about any of this, they told me I was fine and I should just keep going. And even in the ER, when I was checked out, they hooked me up to various machines and did tests on me and blood work, and they asked me a million questions. They eventually sent me on my way and told me that I was just one of 10 people who has heart palpitations. What they never asked was what I had going on. Had they asked and I had told them that my mother had just died and I was a college freshman and that my father was also ill, that may have been a clue as to why I was experiencing the kind of anxiety I was. But because no one told me about it, I didn't even actually link the connection between my anxiety and my grief. This was 1997 when my mother died. So a while ago now, it's been 27 years. Her death anniversary was just this past January 24th. And in that time, in the last almost 3 decades, we have reached really amazing new understandings of grief, of anxiety, of mental health, therapy, utilizing resources and getting support for these things. But back in the late 90s, even then, I just really didn't know who to turn to and really didn't know how to connect these things. My father died when I was 25 years old, and I was his caregiver in hospice. This time, he really wanted to face his death, and having not been there with my mother at the end of her life, I wanted to be there with him and really help him face his own death as well. It was incredibly difficult. I was post-college. All my friends and peers were doing very different things with their lives. They were in their post-college jobs and living in new apartments and trying out, relationships and going out with their friends on the weekend. And I was caring for my dad at home, changing his catheter, scrubbing his dentures, helping the hospice nurses come and go, and getting up in the middle of the night with him. It was really, really hard and also really beautiful and really a privilege to be there in many ways. But being a caregiver is incredibly difficult, as I'm sure many of you know, and so many people in this country and in the world are experiencing at any given moment. Another thing that we need to keep working on is caregiver support. My father's death was as beautiful as a death can be, and I do believe death can be beautiful. I was holding his hand. He died in his home at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night in August. But after he was gone, I felt very alone in the world. Had no parents, no immediate family, had a bunch of 20-something friends with not a lot of great advice for me. And again, everything kind of presented as anxiety. I was just so scared. So much had happened since I was 14. They had been sick and dying. And here I was now alone. And the world just felt like a really scary place. Like terrible things could happen a lot, all the time. I didn't know really, again, still where to turn and what to do. And again, still really wasn't putting the pieces together about my anxiety and my grief. At some point, I read a book about trauma and PTSD, and I thought, I wonder if some of this is connected to that. I wonder if my anxiety is connected to my grief. I eventually went on and got my master's degree in clinical psychology, became a therapist, and my first job out of school was in hospice. I loved working in hospice. We'd had a really good experience with my dad. And I think that hospice is such an important realm and service that we have for people who are dying and the families who are supporting them. And working in hospice, I met some of the best people I've ever met in my life, the nurses, the doctors, the chaplains. It was incredible. But I went into that work thinking I knew a lot about grief. And what I realized very quickly was that I only knew my grief. I only knew my experience of my parents losing them. And there were so many other manifestations and presentations of grief that I was seeing day after day. I would visit with patients as they were dying, and then I would also meet with families after the patient was gone. And so many different relationships, so many different deaths, so many different illnesses, so many different ways of being in this world and of grieving. And I began to learn so much more about grief. I still feel like I learn about grief every day. Every time I sit with a new client, I learn more about grief. I always want to come from a place of being open to what people are bringing into the room. We can learn about grief all day in classes like this and in books and textbooks, but everyone has their own experience of it. While there are universal traits, it's still very individual for so many people. And so trying never to presume what we might know about grief is really important. And I'm talking so much about grief, and I will talk a lot about grief today because it's really important to understand a client's grief in relation to their anxiety. It's really a twofold part of the process, and I'll talk more about that. But as I began to go through, as I began to work with clients one-on-one, I started seeing more and more of this grief-related anxiety. I started seeing it in all of the people I was working with. They were bringing in stories of similar things, going to the ER with panic attacks, hypochondria, social phobias, general just anxiety and unease, so many different aspects of it. And I started to realize that this was such a very real part of grief, but I wasn't seeing it written about anywhere. It wasn't in any of the grief books I was reading. It wasn't online anywhere. I wrote an article in 2014 for slate.com, maybe 2013, entitled Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief. And that article went crazy. And so many people began to write to me, and they began to come to my office, and they started to say, is this a real thing, this grief and anxiety? I think I have it. And I was then afforded the opportunity to really work with so many people who were experiencing this grief anxiety and learn even more about it, learn how to work with it, how to help clients through it, learn all the different ways it manifests and presents, learn why it happens. So I have a lot of information to share with you guys. I decided I had to build on that article and on the work I was doing and write this book about it. So in 2018, my anxiety book came out, and it was called Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief. It came out very quietly in 2018, and then it came out in paperback in May of 2020, at the time when the entire world was going through grief and anxiety. And the book just really bloomed for so many people. And since then, I've been talking a lot about grief and anxiety. Okay, that's enough of the background stuff. So the correlation between grief and anxiety, there's so many reasons we experience it. And I'm sure if you've worked with any clients who have come in grief and they're also experiencing anxiety within that, it's often pretty easy to see why. One reason might be our unsympathetic grief culture. So many people are startled to find a lack of support when they're grieving. There's so little recognition of the depths of their grief, of what they might need to support them as they go through this process, of all the life changes they're going through while they're grieving. And there's very little recognition of how long we grieve. So often many people are kind of met by their community and family in the first weeks of grief. But then as time goes on, everybody kind of steps away and they expect the grieving person to move on much more quickly than they do. This can cause anxiety. I think the surprising depth and emotion of grief is often something that causes anxiety for people. Grief is such an intense experience in many ways. There are little griefs that we go through. There are really huge griefs. We lose a child, we lose a spouse, we lose a parent, a family member, even a pet. Sometimes the grief is so huge that the anguish is so intense. The agony, the missing, the yearning for that person is just so palpable. And often people feel very overwhelmed by that experience of the intensity of the emotion. They have never experienced that depth before. And they suddenly feel like they don't know themselves. They can't trust themselves to go to the grocery store. They might have a grief attack or collapse crying or get triggered by something. They might see a box of cereal that their loved one used to eat, and it might cause them, to spiral into grief. And so all of a sudden walking around with that level of emotion and not knowing quite how to manage it or how to support it causes a lot of anxiety. It's one of the reasons people start getting very insular when they're grieving. They may not go out as much. They become less social. They may drop away from friends at times. Another reason is the new or deepened fear of mortality. Most of us can say all day that we understand that we're going to die, that everybody dies, but until you actually experience the death of someone close to you, you are really hit with it in a new way that feels very startling and often very scary. That realization that someone can be here one moment and gone the next is a really new kind of awareness that we begin to take on. Some people really don't lose anyone significant for decades into their lives. And so when they do, again, it's startling and it can be really scary. They might start to see, worry about things everywhere, worry that something else bad is going to happen, worried that what's the next shoe that's going to drop. So they're suddenly carrying that new fear and that new anxiety. They may be worrying about their own mortality, how long they may be here, what time they have left in their own lives. And so that's another thing that can cause anxiety. Trauma, obviously, there are many ways to lose somebody in a traumatic way. And as we've finally begun to recognize in our culture, trauma is something that is experienced very frequently by everybody. There's little traumas, there's big traumas, but when we lose someone we love, there are so many different ways to experience trauma. Even as a caregiver, you can experience trauma caring for someone who is ill, loved one. You can experience trauma when you lose somebody to suicide, addiction, murder, seeing an accident happen. There are many, many different ways to take on trauma when we lose someone. That obviously comes with anxiety. Inadequate processing, and we're going to talk a lot about that today. So often when people come to see me with this grief-related anxiety, they have not even allowed themselves to process this loss. They have not opened up space for their grief. They haven't let themselves really sit with and feel everything that's going on. That when you aren't letting yourself be in your grief, when you're trying to tamp it down, and we do it for so many reasons. We do it because we have to work. We do it because we're running households and families, or our families aren't supporting our grief, or we don't have time. There's so many reasons that we aren't safe enough to grieve. So many reasons that we aren't processing our grief. But when we don't process it, it spills out all over the place. Anxiety, anger, fear, irritability, relationship problems, addictions. So really kind of looking at that, processing, how much has someone begun to process their loss? The broad effects of loss, secondary losses. Someone can go through a loss that then ensues so many secondary losses. They might be forced to move out of their home, or they may take on financial hardship or become a caregiver or have to take on children or new responsibilities that they didn't have before. They may lose a social circle. They may lose a partner who's there to say good night to them every night. Someone who takes care of them, cooks for them. There are so many secondary losses. I could go on and on about them. Losing so many other things in that ripple effect also causes a lot of anxiety. You go through this one big loss and you think that you're going to have to work on processing that, but you can't even get to it because you're trying to keep up with all these secondary losses that keep happening. Repressed grief is similar to inadequate processing, really trying to tamp down that grief. So many people, I've heard so many times, people say that they're afraid to let themselves grieve. They're afraid that if they start crying, they'll never stop. They're afraid that they'll fall apart if they open up that door of grief. So sometimes the instinct is just to push it down. They can't afford to fall apart with work or family obligations or just fear of that falling apart, not having support around them. Breaks my heart to think about how many people in this country are just alone, who don't have support, who don't have friends and family close by. Someone like that is absolutely afraid to grieve. So they may be repressing it. And then we move on to inadequate processing of anxiety. That's another one that we slam the door on. Anxiety itself is scary. I think that when we start to experience anxiety, whether it's something we've experienced before or it's new, it can be really frightening. We don't know when it's going to happen. It manifests in so many different ways. It can be really overwhelming. And so that's another thing that we try to tamp down. We try to ignore it. We try to stuff it away. We cope with it in unhealthy ways, but we basically just try to keep that anxiety repressed and not deal with it. That just causes more anxiety. And finally, a kind of failure to face and embrace death. This idea that, we are all going to die and our lives here and our time here are finite. This is really not helped by our culture and our medical system. I can't tell you how many people I have met with who were not informed by a medical system that their loved one was so close to death, that there were so little options left, that there was so little hope left for their person. And our medical system and our medical community at large is very much at fault for this. We don't even teach death and dying in medical school. Doctors and nurses aren't trained to have conversations about end of life and talk about it. We saw so much of this fallout during the pandemic when suddenly there were so many people who had never been trained or prepared to face this much death. We're trying so hard to grapple with it and trying so hard to see families and patients through the end of their lives. But when you have that kind of system, it results in a whole culture of people who are really afraid to look and talk about death. And when we can't look at it and can't talk about it, there's an underlying anxiety that's there because we know it's happening. We know it's going to happen. Some of the grief-related anxiety symptoms that you may see, these are all the most common ones that I have seen in all my years of working with this. Panic attacks. So many clients have come to me after first going to the ER. They've had 1 to 3 panic attacks, landed in the ER with it, thinking they were dying, thinking they were having a heart attack or an aneurysm or just feeling crazy. They end up in the ER. And thankfully today, unlike my experience 30 years ago, the physicians are a bit more skilled in seeing anxiety and saying, hey, I think maybe this is anxiety and you should go talk to someone. And then they end up in my office. So panic attacks is a pretty common one. And often, I'll say this more than once today too, you can experience grief-related anxiety, whether or not you've ever experienced a lot of anxiety in your life before. There are some people who I've met with who really have never experienced this kind of anxiety. They haven't really had much anxiety at all in their lives, maybe a normal baseline of it, getting ready to prepare for tests or, perform in a sporting event or something. But that's a normal baseline of anxiety. They've never experienced this kind of anxiety. And then there are people who've always grappled with anxiety throughout their whole lives. They've been worriers or catastrophizers or, all kinds of different forms of it. And then they go through a big loss and the anxiety either upticks or is, manifesting in really new ways. Hypervigilance is a really big one that I see all the time. It's that sudden worry that something else bad is going to happen. When we have that really big reminder of mortality, and when we lose someone that we love, when we lose someone significant, we are again really kind of hit in the face with the reminder that all kinds of things can happen at any time, that life is indeed uncertain, and that we can plan all we want, but we can't always not expect for things to go in different directions. And then that can be really scary. So we become very hypervigilant, really focused on our environment, what's happening around us, what can we control, what can we think through ahead of time. And that can be really exhausting. This is a really exhausting symptom of grief-related anxiety. Excessive worry is a little bit similar to hypervigilance in some ways, but it's just worrying about everything all the time, really not being able to relax in any kind of environment or any situation. Anything that is coming up, someone will see a problem that could arise with it or a catastrophe that could happen. So they're just always worrying. Worry can be very addictive, and this kind of excessive worry is also really exhausting. Hypochondria and just fear of illness and an obsession with one's health is very common. You'll see it happen with worrying about other people's health. Maybe you begin to worry about people in your family getting sick and dying, but you often also really see it happen in the person themselves who is grieving. They begin to just notice every little thing going on in their body, every tick, every ache, every pain, every function of the body becomes just much more present to them, and they begin to worry about it. They're Googling symptoms, they're going to the doctor extra, they're imagining the worst case scenario all the time. And that's a really hard one. I've seen so many clients come through with that. Again, I'm going to walk through so many great tools to work with all of these, but I just want to outline them first. Irritability and restlessness. This is kind of one that people might not notice that much. Anxiety can present as just this irritability and this restlessness. There's just kind of something under the surface that makes people uneasy, unable to relax, and that can cause irritability and restlessness. Social phobias, really beginning to become afraid either of just normal interactions in your environment, going to the grocery store, going to work, or, social circles with friends, family members. Some of this has to do with the changes that you go through when you're grieving, not really feeling vulnerable all the time, not really knowing what to expect of yourself at any given moment. So often when you go through a significant loss, you just can't know what to expect anymore of yourself. You may find, and you find this out just kind of starting to try to go back into your life, and you go to a party or you go just to something that you normally would have, and you're suddenly triggered, or you're overwhelmed, or you feel really sad and have to leave the room, or you're angry and irritable. You can't stand normal conversation anymore. All of this can lend to this really new lens of just becoming afraid of social environments. Racing and recurrent thoughts. A lot of rumination comes into this as well. You see a lot of rumination occur in grief and in grief-related anxiety. Insomnia, really not being able to sleep, that will come sometimes too with that hypervigilance, not being able to rest, not being able to really feel safe and secure. Grief attacks. These are the kinds of things when you might be having a totally fine day and think you're doing well. And then again, you're at the grocery store or something and you become triggered and you just become absolutely overwhelmed with grief. And that is so scary. I had a client tell me once she had lost a son, and she walked into a sporting goods store one afternoon having a fine day, and there was a boy that looked so much like her son, and she had to run to her car and just collapse in her car for a period of time. It's so hard. And not knowing if you can expect these things to happen causes that anxiety as well. Uncontrollable crying. I've heard people tell me that they had no idea they could cry as much as they do. Every day crying, long bouts of crying, sobbing, heaving. It can be overwhelming. These are some of the different types of grief-related anxiety and their manifestations. There's generalized anxiety, constant worry, feeling of dread, panic attacks again, hypochondria, social phobias. Some OCD behaviors might pop up, just again, that real wanting to control everything in your environment so that you're not feeling as vulnerable, so that nothing else bad happens. PTSD with nightmares, memories of the trauma, triggers. Specific phobias, sometimes they become places, objects, people that you are really afraid to be around or interact with because they trigger so much. Separation anxiety, feeling fearful and afraid of being alone or being abandoned. Okay, let me see. So how is grief-related anxiety different from general anxiety? The anxiety level is linked directly to the grief. It's either, again, like I said, it's coming on for the very first time in someone's life. They've really experienced very little anxiety before, or it's strengthening after a loss. Suddenly they've maybe experienced, anxiety through their life, but never like this. It's stronger, it's bigger, it's more unpredictable, or it has more manifestations and symptoms. They have obsessive thoughts and ruminations about the person who died. So it's very specifically linked to the loss itself. Fear of death and hypochondria that comes on. Again, that's very related to the grief. The obsessive worry about the well-being of other loved ones, worrying for their own safety, mortality, health. Anxious attachments and relationships can really occur in this kind of grief-related anxiety. And also avoidance of death and grief-related matters. These are all distinctive to grief-related anxiety and make it different from general anxiety. Before I move on to that, I'm just going to say one thing. So when I work with clients who come in, say somebody comes in following the loss of a parent and they've gone to the ER with a panic attack and they've now landed in my office and they're really just starting to put these pieces together that their anxiety is linked to their grief. I really want to work with them in tandem with both of their grief and their anxiety at the same time. So even in a first session, I'm wanting to find out as much as I can about the loss, how it happened, how long ago, their connection and relationship to the person who died, what kind of processing they've done of that loss, how they've experienced their grief. Have they grieved? How have they grieved? What has it been like? Have they been angry? Have they been sad? Have they been, how has it been playing out for them? When do they let themselves feel their grief? What ways have they ritualized or memorialized their person? What ways are they feeling able to feel connected to them or to think about them and talk about them? So really kind of digging into how has their grief process been so far? How is it presenting? And then also at the same time, really wanting to dig into the anxiety. How is the anxiety presenting? The client came in for a panic attack from an ER. Is it only panic attacks? Have they experienced anything else? Are they anxious first thing in the morning? Is it something that comes on later? Are they anxious all day? Is it worrying about other people? Is it worrying about themselves and their own health? Is it all of these various ways that I've been talking about, the ways that it presents itself? So I want to be finding out about these two things together because it's really important to work with them together. So even in that first session, I want to be talking about the grief, starting to help them unpack it a little bit, explore it a little bit, starting to open up their story of grief, but then also really trying to get a handle on their anxiety and how it's presenting. Also normalizing that anxiety for them, giving them some tools and tips, even in that first session before they leave, how to manage a panic attack or how to start to think about recognizing their anxious symptoms. I often ask people to start a little notebook or a log, write down every time you're anxious before we meet again next week, write down the anxious thoughts you had, write down how you felt when you had them, write down how you responded. What did you do that helped? What did you do that didn't help? Really helping them understand why that anxiety is coming up, validating for them and recognizing for them how huge their loss is, how scary it might be, some of the secondary losses that they've incurred that might even make their life more unstable in some ways. So you really want to be kind of digging into both places at the same time as you move forward. And really working with an anxious, grieving client, it's always going to kind of be like that, these two threads that you're working through, because the anxiety, you can work with just the anxiety. You can treat just the anxiety with them. There's so many cognitive behavioral tools and things you can do for anxiety that really help. But unless you're also really working with them to process that loss and help them unpack their grief and learn how to carry grief, the anxiety is going to perpetuate no matter how much you're doing to kind of learn how to manage it and tools you're going to use. I hope that makes sense. And I'll kind of continue to talk about that idea because it's just what I've found to be really important, is to be working with these two facets at the same time. So understanding kind of general anxiety, and this is something I want to talk about with my clients right away too. Again, talking about anxiety can make people anxious. Just the idea of anxiety makes people anxious. So we're trying to push it away all the time. People don't want to think about it. They don't want to open up the door of anxiety. They don't want to talk about it even more because that might make them more anxious. So often they really don't know much about anxiety. So helping them just understand kind of general ideas about anxiety, that anxiety is about fear, that it's about uncertainty, that at its core, like it says here, anxiety is fear of something real or imagined. When we're grieving and we go through a loss, it's both, right? We've gone through something very real. This real, terrible thing has happened. And now we're imagining a lot of other real, terrible things that could happen. So you're living in a lot of kind of unreal and real scenarios within that anxiety, and helping people understand that it's a normal way of just wanting to kind of control this uncontrollable environment. I think the pandemic is a great way to look at it. You know, we were all just kind of going along, living our lives, had all kinds of things planned and thought we knew what was happening. And then this pandemic just landed in the middle of everything and everything came to a halt. And you suddenly couldn't count on what you knew the future to be. We didn't know when things would go back to normal. In the beginning, we didn't know how bad it was. There was so much fear. Every day you were sitting and living in this kind of anxiety and this uncertainty. And so helping someone really understand that and draw the connection to what it's been like to go through their loss and suddenly be in this place of uncertainty and fear. And the thing that I really want to help my clients understand is that the way to learn how to manage anxiety and move through it is to get to know it. And I know that that's scary for so many people. They're just so afraid to even just talk about their anxiety because it's going to come on more if they do. But really the way to get to work with it is to get to know it. Getting to know when it comes up, what happens, all those things I kind of talked about as homework for clients when they're going home between sessions, really opening up that door to learning about how your anxiety works is the first step towards managing it. And it's not as scary as people think. Also reminding people that anxiety on some level is normal. Like we all experience anxiety throughout our days and our lives. Some of it's very low, minimal anxiety. When I heard that over 16,000 people had registered for this, I got a little anxious, but that is normal anxiety, right? Like that's just a kind of normal anxiety that helps you stay on task, helps you prepare for things, anxiety before you take a big trip, or anxiety before you start something new for the first time, go to a new class or something like that. That's a normal anxiety. So reminding people that like there's a certain level of anxiety that we always have and that it's useful and it's okay. When the anxiety is spiking so high in so many different manifestations, when it is prohibiting us from living our normal lives, when it's, getting in the way of daily functioning, where we can't operate in our relationships as usual, or where it can't go to work as usual, that's when we really need to learn to work on it and get some help with it. But again, helping people kind of understand that is important. Anxiety is incredibly common. These are statistics from pre-pandemic. I need to put some new ones in here, but 15% of the population of the United States, roughly 40 million people have suffered from anxiety in the last year. I would say it's probably 40% of the population at this point. But, these days it's leading ahead of depression. College students, younger people are struggling with anxiety more than ever. I think that there is so much that's happened in the last 20 years around technology that contributes to anxiety. I think the amount of information we download in a given day, in a given moment, an hour, from television, from screens, from podcasts, from everything. I mean, I would bet that the majority of you look at your phone before you even get out of bed in the morning. And when we do that, and we all do it, I'm guilty of it too, we are downloading so much information in an instant before we have even started our day. We know what our best friend had for breakfast last night. We know what the president said yesterday. We know about a horrific crime that occurred by looking at Nextdoor or whatever we're seeing. There's so much social media and Instagram, things that make us feel insecure, things that make us feel excited, things that make us feel afraid, all at once, like all in 90 seconds of looking at your phone. The anxiety levels that produces are really different from 25 years ago when we didn't have that much information coming in all the time. And we are, I think, only now really starting to understand that we need to regulate and modulate the amount of information that's coming in. When you're grieving and you're downloading that much information too, it's just overwhelm. It's just absolute overwhelm. And so I think that all of it's on the uptick for these reasons. Again, normalizing anxiety for clients is really important. We talk about anxiety all the time. People constantly talk about it on TV shows and Instagram and whatnot, but until you've really experienced some debilitating anxiety, I think a lot of people don't know what it is. And so they'll come in with a real lack of awareness around anxiety and how it works. And so just starting some psychoeducation around it for them is important in those early sessions. Talking about the anxiety response, high levels, low levels of anxiety, how it works in our bodies. I think that this is one of the biggest misconceptions that people have around anxiety, is just how physical it is. People often mistake these physical symptoms for an ailment, an illness. This is how they end up in the ER sometimes, or going to their doctor. They're feeling racing hearts, they're sweating, they're getting stomach aches, head pains, all of these kinds of things that are just a result of anxiety occurring in their bodies. And they're not quite realizing that that's what's happening. And then the physical symptoms are leading to more anxiety. It's a really fun cycle. Helping them understand that is really important. Our bodies are trained to react to fear. We know this, but I want you to think about it in terms of grief. So often people tell me, and I experience this myself, when you go through a significant loss, it's the first thing you think about in the morning, or at 4 o'clock in the morning when you wake up in the middle of the night. Your eyes open and your first thought is, oh my God, my person is dead. And the feeling and the thought and everything that knowledge evokes is so scary. It's just so scary. The future is completely different now. Your life, the landscape of it is completely different. There's a lot of fear that comes with it. And all of that can have these physical manifestations. So a lot of the time, again, it's this like the physical stuff happens, it makes us anxious, the anxiety is happening, creating the physical symptoms. So really kind of helping people to understand that too, I give them such basic tools, box breathing, just helping regulate their nervous system, calm themselves down, send that message to themselves that they're safe. A lot of people are experiencing this anxiety and they're not even thinking about it that consciously. It's just an underlying thought that's going on in the background, and that's causing anxiety. So they don't realize it. Or maybe they had a dream about someone that's kind of set off a physical response. They'll be at work and an anxiety attack will kick on, and they'll think, where did this even come from? And so often there's been so much going on in the back of our minds leading up towards it. Again, the intense amount of emotions. I'm sure many of you here have experienced some big grief. Almost everybody who shows up to things I do is coming with grief. And that therefore, how intense it is, how big it is, how overwhelming it can be. That yearning, that pain, that deep anguish, the missing, it's so big. It's so much bigger than other things regular stuff that we experience in our lives. And so just working with that and understanding that it's okay to feel that, really helping people find the right support that they need to experience this kind of intense emotion. So again, I've been saying this a lot. Anxiety perpetuates itself. Most of my clients will tell me that they're just really afraid to even talk about it. They're afraid that it's going to bring on more anxiety. They're afraid to tell people that they're experiencing anxiety. One of the really tricky things about anxiety is that you can really hide it. You can be sitting in a boardroom next to all of your colleagues, and you can be having a racing heart and sweating palms and just feel like the world is about to end at any second. Yet you might appear really calm on the outside. No one knows that you're experiencing that. You're like living in terror inside, and yet you look like you're just sitting at the boardroom table. And so people will hide their anxiety because they're afraid to talk about it. They're afraid to acknowledge it. Really helping people see that, begin to talk about it more, begin to acknowledge it even for themselves more. Anxiety can also become addictive in a lot of ways. People are afraid to stop worrying. They're afraid to stop catastrophizing. They're afraid that if they stop worrying about things, then it's really going to happen. And if they can think through every worst case scenario, if they can worry their way through everything possible, then maybe they can control the outcome of a scenario. And so a lot of times you'll hear people really kind of afraid to start working on their anxiety. Helping them to understand that remaining in that hypervigilant state all the time is causing so much distress. It's causing so many problems with their nervous system. It's preoccupying them in so many different ways. It can have problems with your health, and obviously it can create issues with work, relationships, all kinds of interactions. So really kind of walking them through this idea that you understand it can be scary to start to work on the anxiety and to let go of it. What to expect with anxious clients: they may be agitated, restless. Again, they may experience anxiety by talking about anxiety. They may have difficulty talking about their grief. So often, this is one of the really core components of grief-related anxiety, is this people haven't faced the grief. They haven't opened up to it. They're afraid of that as well. They're afraid to talk about it, afraid to talk about the loss. They might have difficulty describing their anxiety or even recognizing all the symptoms of it. And they may want to focus on their anxiety more than their grief, because obviously that's the thing that's driving them in often. You know, it's the thing that's plaguing their days, making things really difficult, just this debilitating anxiety they're feeling. And so when they come in and I want to ask them more about their loss, they're like, yeah, but I want to get back to this anxiety. And so trying to even help them understand how important it is to be processing and working on both of them at the same time. These are some questions to ask, and I know you all have these slides, so here and there, I'll skip through some of these kind of quickly. These are things you can come back to, questions you want to be asking clients. These are the kinds of things that I really want to be asking them in the first sessions, and things that I want them to be thinking about in between sessions. And I want them to be noticing and jotting them down and really starting to become aware for themselves, kind of the cadence of their anxiety. When did it start? Was it before the loss or only since then? If it was before the loss, what was it like? What was anxiety like for you before this loss happened? And how is it different now? When do you feel anxious? This is such an important one. Some people feel anxious all the time, constant. It's unrelenting. And then some people are very triggered by certain things, environments, ideas, words, images, music, scents. Some people are triggered by certain times of the day, anniversaries, seasons of time, holidays, people. And then sometimes there's almost like a rhythm to their anxiety. Maybe they wake up feeling fine, and somehow by 10 or 11 a.m., the anxiety has just kicked on, and it's that general sense of unease. Everyone's kind of rhythm of anxiety is different. And so really helping someone to understand it and to notice it is it really helpful. They can begin to prepare for it, work around it, really begin to get ready for when it comes on, and have tools in place rather than being, surprised by it or just trying to avoid it. How does their anxiety manifest? Again, there's so many different components and symptoms for anxiety. Some people experience all of them all the time. It's horrible. Some people have one or two that are really their predominant anxiety symptoms. Finding out how they've managed it so far. Usually people haven't been managing it very well. Usually they've been managing it with ignoring it, with wine, with other substances. They've been ignoring it, playing video games or watching television or shopping or any other kind of way that they can escape and get away from it and numb. So helping them kind of start to see those patterns as well and start to replace those with healthy ways to manage the anxiety. What behaviors are a result of their anxiety? Again, this is often the ways that they manage it. The anxiety comes on and they immediately reach for that glass of wine, or the anxiety comes on, maybe they have something healthy. They know that going for a walk outside really helps kind of reset them and calm them down. Great, let's do more of that. Let's plan for these kinds of things. Let's find out what other things like that help. Finding out, what environments feel good to them and which ones cause anxiety. You may have really tough cases where someone is in a work environment that is just causing unrelenting anxiety and they can't afford not to be there. So trying to figure out how to manage and provide tools so that they can go back to that environment. Sometimes people can stop going into places that cause anxiety, starting to find better places that feel good and feel safe. And then finding out how it's affecting their life. Again, because anxiety is so easy to hide, sometimes people don't even realize how much it is affecting them, that the quality of their relationships, the quality of their work, their interactions with family, and obviously if they're taking medication for anxiety or not. So more symptoms of anxiety. These are some of the physical symptoms: irregular heartbeat, dizziness, lightheadedness, shortness of breath, nausea, sweating, fatigue. All of these are physical symptoms of anxiety. More reasons that we are experiencing it. And normalizing it. Again, I think that this is something you just can't do often enough for your grieving clients. It's just normalizing both their grief and their anxiety. So we're going to talk a little bit about grief because, again, working with these two things in tandem is really important. I love that so many more clinicians are grief informed these days, but it always helps to just learn a little bit more about it. I've been learning about grief for so many years now, and I think there's always still more to know. But there are obvious types of grief. Anticipatory, that's the kind of grief we experience when we're facing a loss. This is something we experience when we know that a loved one has a terminal illness, is going to die. Maybe we don't know when, and we're living in this anticipatory grief for quite some time. We can experience anticipatory grief when we know we're going to be leaving a job or moving, that a relationship is going to end at some point. That kind of anticipatory grief, two things to note about it. One is that it lends itself to a lot of anxiety because there's so much uncertainty in the period of anticipatory grief. You don't know when exactly this thing is going to happen. Even if you do, it's kind of the clock is ticking towards it, causing that anxiety to ramp up. And the second thing is that it doesn't take away from the amount of grief you're going to experience after the loss. It's not like you can pre-grieve a whole bunch and then you won't have to grieve as much after the loss. Anticipatory grief is kind of its own version of grief. And then after you go through the loss, then you're in another grief. And just because you were experiencing the anticipatory grief doesn't mean you're not going to feel everything that you're feeling now. So I think some people hope this to be the case, and they'll say, oh, I knew my person was sick or dying for a long time, so I've already grieved. And then they die and they're like, oh, I thought I had grieved and now I'm grieving more. And again, complicated grief. There is complicated grief for so many different reasons. I see complicated grief all day, every day. The ways that a person died, the relationship we had with them, the grieving person's disposition, personality, mental health, support, resources, anything that can get in the way of grief can complicate it. When we lose someone to suicide, addiction, murder, there are pieces and layers of those losses that are so consuming and complicated that you can't even get to the raw, pure grief. I've worked with a lot of clients who have lost a loved one in a mass shooting. That's very complicated grief. You can't just purely grieve and miss that person. You're also filled with anger and confusion and anguish over how this happened. You're seeing the news every day and being triggered by it all the time. There's so many layers to it that come with something like that. Your grief becomes public. It makes it very complicated. It extends the process. Working through some of those layers to process them can and obviously does help, but it just is more complicated and takes longer. People who've been in estranged relationships, or you lose a loved one who was abusive, or a person who was abusive, there are so many layers that make things complicated, and really being able to sit with that and recognize that for clients, helping them grieve all the different things they didn't get to have, the death they didn't get to have, the loss they didn't get to have, the ways that that person died. It's a lot, but I think it's more common, far more common than people realize. Ambiguous grief. This is grief that comes with lack of closure, information resolution. There's a fair amount of these as well. Sometimes people don't know how their person died. And that lends itself to a lot of ambiguous grief. It's really hard to, again, kind of feel like you can just focus on the grief and the missing of them when you're preoccupied with how this has even happened or what the details were surrounding it. This is also grief that we feel in divorce and breakups, estrangement, grief when the person is still here, but we're disconnected from them in some way. This is also can be similar to disenfranchised grief. This is the grief that's not recognized by those around us. This is in the case of pregnancy loss, infertility, racism, retirement, pet loss, empty nesting, the kind of grief that you are really feeling and that people around you aren't recognizing or validating for you. This is heartbreaking. Disenfranchised grief is really heartbreaking, and it's so important and helpful for you to be able to sit with these people who are experiencing it and recognize it and see it, validate their grief in these cases. And collective grief. We've all experienced a fair amount of collective grief in the last few years. And so I think just thinking about all the grief that we carry, we may be carrying collective, cumulative grief for things that are occurring in the world around us. And then you may go through a personal loss as well. And it becomes so magnified, and you're carrying so many different types of grief. Characteristics of grief are important to think about. Again, really getting to know somebody's loss is helpful in terms of really understanding their grief and how their grief is operating. We have anticipated losses when we know someone is going to die. We have sudden and unexpected losses, and this lends itself to sometimes more complicated grief. There's a lot more different traits we go through in the beginning of an unexpected and sudden loss that are different from an anticipated loss. Perhaps a lot of shock and disbelief, time to really process and understand what has happened. We can have an anticipated loss that is sudden. This is in the case of maybe someone who has a terminal illness, but we think that they have months or maybe even years to live, and then they die suddenly for some reason. So you can experience kind of both of those things in many ways. I see that a lot of the time. Traumatic and violent losses. And really, again, thinking about the kind of relationship we had with the person. There are so many different relationships we can have in this world, and all of them lend themselves to different forms of grief. So what does grief look like? It looks like so many different things. I've put this on social media before, like asking people just, what do you think grief looks like? And these are just some of the answers that I've accrued, and they could go on and on and on. I'm always getting this feeling like you're going crazy, when. People say that a lot. But as you can see on this list, like some of these are opposites. Some of these are really similar and they overlap. You can feel all of these. You can feel one of these. You can feel none of them. And you may have your own different ones. You can come in and out of these all day long. There are so many different ways that grief feels and looks. One of the common characteristics, especially with sudden and unexpected losses, are just the disbelief and the numbness and the resistance to the reality of it. It's very normal to experience this kind of numbness and disbelief. It's really hard to just even process in the beginning the reality of a huge loss. And it takes time for our brains to get there. It takes time for our hearts to get there. It takes time for us to feel safe enough sometimes to stop feeling numb or to start believing that this is real, that this has actually happened. And then we also find all kinds of ways to try to extend that feeling of disbelief because we don't want it to be real. Sadness, sorrow, anguish, these are some of the most common feelings that come with grief. Any of you who have grieved, I'm sure you know some of these to some extent. But again, these look really different for some people. Some people, they don't lean towards these emotions in the first place. They may lean much more into anger, much more into kind of bigger, powerful emotions. They may be someone who really doesn't like to feel that sadness, that sorrow. And so they push into other directions and let themselves feel very little of this. And then there are those of us who really like lean towards this direction in our emotional realms. And we can experience great depths of sadness and sorrow and really kind of sit within those places. Everyone is different with this. There's no right or wrong way. It's absolutely okay to just feel flooded with sadness and sorrow. And it's also all right to not quite feel that all the time. I think if someone isn't feeling sadness and sorrow and anguish, probing into that and looking at it a little bit more, if they're really avoiding it, that's something to work on. But in some cases, this is not someone's natural disposition. Anxiety and fear, which we've been talking about, and we'll talk more about that for the next couple of hours. Anger, irritability, rage. These are very common feelings in grief. But again, some people really may not experience these. You may meet a lot of people who don't experience any anger in their grief at all. And then some people who that is their predominant presentation of grief. They go directly to anger, and there may be very valid reasons to be angry. And anger may also be an avoidant technique. I like to say that almost always underneath anger is fear and sadness, but it's much easier to reside in anger sometimes. It can be more satisfying, it can be more powerful, it can be more motivating. So you'll find a lot of people in places of anger. There's also a lot to be angry at. If you had a terrible medical experience with your loved one, they had a not good death, something that wasn't deserved, or their treatment wasn't great. There's a lot of anger there. If you lost somebody, again, to like something like a mass shooting, of course, there's going to be anger there. And these are really important feelings to feel and to look at and to talk about. Guilt and regret, and we'll talk a little bit more about those today. Those are some of the most difficult yet really common feelings that people have. They experience a lot of guilt and regret after losing a loved one. Not everybody experiences it, but a lot of people will. Sometimes it's almost like a made up guilt or regret, that just a wishing to go back, a wishing to do something over, a feeling that they weren't good enough and didn't do something well enough, didn't show their loved one how much they loved them, even though maybe they really did. And they're just unable to let themselves feel that. And then sometimes there are very real things to regret or to feel guilty about. Maybe you were in an argument with your person when they died. Maybe like my case, I wasn't there when my mother died, even though I wanted to be. I felt so much guilt over that for years. You may worry and regret different choices around medical care or end of life care. There's a lot of things here, and all of them must be sorted through. When someone is carrying guilt and regret, it must be sorted through in order to continue to process this grief. And if it's not, that is another place that anxiety shows up. Hope and relief. sometimes people experience hope and relief after losing a loved one or a person in their lives, and that's okay too. There are so many reasons for that. Complicated relationships, complicated people, long illnesses. There can be hope and relief within that grief, even when it's sorrowful and sad as well. Oh my gosh, how long does grief last? I talk about this all the time with people. I think that grief can last a lifetime, is basically my answer. It doesn't have to. Not all grief warrants staying with you throughout your life. Again, we do have small griefs. We have ends and closures to things that don't warrant grieving your whole life. And then a lot of us also have significant relationships that extend throughout our lives. I don't think that active grief necessarily lasts a lifetime. I think if someone is actively grieving for years and decades, that there's something there to really work on. But I think that, grief is something that my mother has been gone for 27 years, and my grief for her comes up here and there still. I have 3 kids she's never met. I have a whole life that she's never been privy to. And there are times when I feel that grief come up again, that I've just missed out on so much time with her, and she's missed out on time with me and my family. And that's absolutely normal and understandable. There are times when grief can be triggered too. You go through a big life change, a divorce, your own illness, or facing of mortality, and your grief may come back that you were already experiencing, or that maybe you felt like you had moved past for a while. And then the bottom line is that grief lasts a lot longer than most people think. I think our culture around us and people who have not experienced significant grief really expect grief to last like a few weeks or a few months. And when they see someone a year, 2 years, 5 years out, still really holding a lot of grief, it's very unsettling for them. It's very confusing. They always try to fix it, change it, comment on it, pass judgment on it. This makes people feel ashamed. It makes people hide their grief, makes people question themselves. But grief truly lasts a lot longer. I mean, honestly, do you think someone who loses a child should just be over their grief after a couple of years? That is a grief they will carry for their entire lifetime. And so allowing people a lot of space and time to grieve is so important. Constantly, this is all I talk about, trying to change the culture around this. And the thing that really sucks is that it's always on the griever somehow to be the informant of this. They're the ones that are having to educate and inform people around them. And that's something you'll see expressed a lot in the work that you're doing if you're working with grieving clients, just how hard it is, that all the judgment they'll feel from people around them, the expectations people have for how long they grieve and what it looks like and how they display it, and then how they themselves are the ones that have to often explain to other people how long grief lasts and how many different ways it manifests. The timeline of grief. I love these images. I especially love the one with the jars, because I think that this is really, if you talk to anyone who's really gone through big grief, they do talk about it. It doesn't go away. You learn to carry it. You learn to live with it. The grief that you feel in the beginning of a big loss, it's really not that it goes away. It's just that you become much more used to it, and you become able to move through the world with it. You become able to hold that grief and hold joy. In the beginning, it just feels like you're just holding that grief, and it's so big and it's so heavy, and like you'll never be able to hold anything else. And then in time, you realize you can hold multiple things, and you don't ever have to not have this grief, because some people don't want to let go of their grief. It's a connection to their loved one. It's a way of honoring them, but they learn how to hold both. All the things we grieve, as I've mentioned here and there. I'm going to skip through ahead so we can get to some questions soon. The secondary losses that we experience, I've been touching along these. Okay, I'm going to stop there and take some questions until the half-hour mark, and then we will take a break. Okay, let me see. I'm going to look at the Q&A. Here we go. I was told how to do this. Okay, let me see. I guess these are all the ones that have been upvoted. Am I looking at upvoted ones? Okay, I got it. I'm on this. Sorry. Okay, Penelope. A 2017 article entitled Cautioning Healthcare Professionals, Bereaved Persons Are Misguided Through the Stages of Grief states there is no scientific foundation and decades of research have shown that most people do not grieve in stages. Using stages as a guide in work with the bereaved is unhelpful and may even cause harm. What is your view of the stages in grief and loss? Loss, not just about death, and what research supports your view? I think this is a really important question. And I think, I think there's some stuff in here about Kubler-Ross and the stages in my presentation, but I talk about this all the time because what you will find is that your clients will come in wanting to talk about the 5 stages of grief. That is sometimes the only thing they have ever heard about grief is the 5 stages of grief. And these days, there's so much talk about how the 5 stages are outdated and often unhelpful and maybe even harmful. And I think, that can be true in some ways. I always want to preface that by saying that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself, I think, was an amazing person who laid a lot of foundation for so much of the work myself and others do today. She was starting conversations about death and dying and grief that no one else was willing to have. She really began to open up our culture's understanding and ability to talk about these things. And so I always just want to clarify that even if we are talking about how the stages themselves don't work, she herself was a pretty amazing person, a pioneer in this field. And I always want to recognize that. But the 5 stages, denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance, they can be outdated in many ways, but I think that they're also guideposts. That's what she herself said. They were originally intended for people who were dying, not grieving. She was working in a hospital in the 1960s and really visiting with a lot of patients who were facing terminal illness. And she noticed that they were going through this progression of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. When applied to someone facing a terminal diagnosis, those stages work pretty well. They're not perfect, but they do work much better than they do when applied to grief. Grief is much more mercurial. People don't go through stages in a linear format. They don't always go through all of those 5 stages. There are many other emotions and facets of grief that are not included within those 5 stages. I think the reason that our culture has really clung to the stages is because it's appealing. Wouldn't it be great if there were just these 5 things we had to do to get through grief? So I think people who haven't really experienced grief and don't really know that much about the psychology of it will just be like, oh yeah, aren't there 5 stages I need to do in order to get out of this anguish? And so they'll come to you asking about the 5 stages. But the first thing that I really noticed when I was working in hospice and working with grieving people right away was so much confusion around them. People would say, I think I'm stuck in one, or I skipped one, or I don't get the bargaining one. And so I think it's really helpful to do some psychoeducation with clients and grieving people around the 5 stages. I suppose they could be harmful, but I think that that's a little bit dramatic to say. I think that they can be limiting is what they can be, and unhelpful to some people. To some people, they are really helpful. They do feel, aligned with some of the stages or all of them. And that's great too. Whatever works for people, I think is really important. I hope that answers that question. Let's see. Someone asks how to address grief for kids. If one parent has passed away, at what age can the child be told that her dad, for example, has passed away, and how to help her through it? This is such an important question. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about kids and grief. I think that it's really important to talk to children about death and grief from the get-go. I think that a child should be told right away that someone is gone. However, it's really the work often is around the caregivers and the surviving parent and the adults in that child's life, for them to understand that the child's grief is not going to present the same way that an adult who grieves is. The child is going to, not reach full developmental capacity until their mid-20s. And so as they grieve, say a 6-year-old loses a parent, they're going to developmentally understand that loss at many different times in their childhood and adolescence. They're going to come to new understandings of it over and over. And each time they understand it in a new way, they're going to grieve in a new way. So you actually see a very extended grief that happens when a child or an adolescent loses someone significant. And it's not a bad thing, but what happens is that children just don't display grief the same way that we do. We look at that child and the loss that they've experienced, and we feel so much sadness. We think, oh gosh, their parent isn't going to be there to see them graduate high school and get married or do whatever they do. The child isn't thinking about all of those things. They're very focused on their present day. They're probably thinking about, like, who's going to take me to so-and-so's birthday party on Saturday if my mom isn't here anymore. So they're thinking about very present day needs and concerns. And so it's confusing to adults, though, because children aren't displaying grief in the same ways that we normally recognize. They worry when a child isn't sad, or when a child isn't crying, or when a child isn't talking about it. But what people need to understand is that will continue to evolve. And the most important thing to do is to continue providing that space and openness, so that when children and adolescents do hit those moments of understanding the grief and the loss in a new way, of grieving and feeling it in a new way, you're there and ready to meet them in that space. You're not dismissing it as like, oh my God, that person died 7 years ago. Why are they just now really talking about it and thinking something else is wrong? That's perfectly normal for them. And I think that that's one of the important things that we need to work on. A lot of times I'll work with clients who say a husband will come in and he's lost his wife and he's trying to help his children through it. And this is so much of the work, really helping him understand how his children's grief is going to present and what it's going to look like and what to think about for the years ahead. I have so many clients who've lost a parent because I've talked so much about my own parents in my books and my work. I have a lot of people come to see me for loss of parent, and what they will always do, it's so interesting. They come in when they're in their late 20s and early 30s, and they may have gone through the loss, age 8, age 11, or, 15, something like that. And then it's around their late 20s and early 30s when they suddenly begin to really understand that loss and want to look at it in a way where they can process it on a very deep, mature level. And there's a lot of really beautiful work to be done at that point. But sometimes you really just won't see a lot of that grief processing and displays of it in their earlier years. I hope that is helpful. There's a lot of great books out there on children and grief. Let's see. Margaret says, Claire, after 20 years of working in this field, I'm dumbfounded that this connection of grief and anxiety has not been taught to this level. It makes so much sense, especially sudden losses. Both of my teens developed anxiety due to the sudden losses and traumatic experiences of losing close friends. It's true. It blows my mind too. I just, I don't understand it. I don't understand why people weren't seeing this and looking at it. And it is so important. And I'm so glad that you are all here to talk about it. Okay. Let's see. Do I feel that there are differences between anxious grief and anticipatory grief? Absolutely. I think that actually one of the really distinctive differences would be that you can experience anxiety in that anticipatory grief and not experience it after a loss. Because again, not everybody experiences anxiety after a loss. So because anticipatory grief has a lot of anxiety in it naturally, that you may go through a lot of the anxiety leading up to the loss and then not experience as much of it afterwards. And then in anxious grief, you may not have experienced any anxiety leading up. You may have really been naive or in denial about what this loss was going to be like, or maybe it was a sudden and unexpected loss. And after it has occurred, the anxiety is just immense. And so I think that there are definitely distinctive types of grief. Let me see what else is here. I'm trying to look for these upvote ones. Someone asks, what do we know about what happens in the brain when a person is grieving? And this is such an important question. There's an amazing book out there that you should all get called The Grieving Brain by Mary Frances O'Connor. She outlines all the neuroscience behind what happens when we are grieving in our brains. And it's really fascinating. And I'm not even going to try to butcher it for you, but I will tell you that what's important to know about it is that the brain really truly maps new neural pathways after we go through a loss. The way that she explains it is that our brains are learning a new way to be in the world. So all these ways that I keep talking about, how different the world feels after a significant loss, and just how big and scary and different it can feel. You're seeing the whole world through a new lens after you go through a big loss. And that is you now having to learn how to live in that new world. So your brain is making new pathways and new mapping as you do that, new ways of learning how to be yourself. You change so much after a loss. Your sense of yourself is shifting. Your triggers are shifting. Your ways of being with other people. There is a lot that is changing and happening in the brain. And that is one of the reasons that people will talk about this thing called brain fog or grief fog after a loss. You'll hear a lot of people talk about feeling really forgetful. They can't remember, where they put their keys or what they had for breakfast or what that movie was they watched last night. They just, they feel very forgetful and spacey a lot. And there's so much going on in your brain when you've gone through a big loss, so much that's occupying just your new ways of orienting to the world. If you think about if you go through a loss of a spouse that you have been with for 30 years and you've spent every day with them, you're orienting to being in a world or even just a physical environment, your home, without them. It is absolutely overwhelming. We all know that feeling probably when you lose a beloved pet and you come home and every day you expect to see your pet coming around the corner for those first few days. And your brain every time is having to, remind itself and rewire to the idea that they're no longer here. There's a lot that's happening in the brain. Again, I really recommend the book, The Grieving Brain by Mary Frances O'Connor. I hope that's somewhat helpful. Okay, let's see. There's so many good questions here. Here's a logistical process question. Claire, do you have your clients fill out the intake with loss questions prior to session or ask these questions during the first session? Both. I will have some really basic questions on intake, which are, who did you lose? How long ago? How did they die? And like anything you want me to know about your grief. And so I'll get some really basic stuff there. And then it's always interesting. You can read a few basic things about someone and their loss, and you'll think what might be going on and where you're going to have to go in what direction with this client. And then they come in and it's so different than you imagined, because grief is just it manifests in such different ways for people. And until you hear about, say they write down that they lost a mother, until you hear about how, what their relationship was like with their mom. Maybe they had a terrible relationship. Maybe it was complicated. Maybe she was an addict. Maybe she was loving and her best friend, how they died, was it an illness? Was it an accident? There's so many different things. So, getting some basics is always helpful, but always really walking through all of that in session is important, because there's just so much nuance to it. And all these little details really affect the way that the person is going to grieve. Okay, let me see. Definitely, you guys upvote these things for when we go back to questions at the end, because it's helpful to see what is helpful or what people are really wanting to know about, because there's so many good questions here. I'm sorry, I'm just going through some of these. Here's what we'll do. Why don't we take our break? I'll look at some more of these during the break too. We can all stretch our legs and drink some water, do what we need to do, and we will come back and I will spend some more time answering questions after the second half of the presentation, but I'll try to go through some of these too and definitely upvote some more if there are questions you really want asked. Thank you, guys. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Hope you had a good little break. I stood in the sunshine for a moment and it was good. Okay, we are going to move into talking more about strategies for working with anxiety and grief. I saw someone in the chat wanted to know if I was going to talk about anything other than box breathing for my clients. Yes, I plan to. I will be outlining all of that in the next part of our time together. And there's also a ton of stuff in the workbook, something that you can really I really tried to design this workbook as something that any clinician can use when they're working with people who are grieving and anxious. So I hope that you'll find some really good resources in there. And today, while I am going to go through a lot of tools and exercises and treatment plans to work with people who are anxiously grieving, I also just really wanted to give you guys this overall of what it means to be struggling with anxiety related grief. Again, we've talked a lot about how this hasn't been talked about that much, and there hasn't been, the correlation hasn't been drawn until very recently. And so I think it's important to kind of give this overall, and I really wanted you all to kind of walk away with a good solid foundation and broad understanding of why people come into grief with anxiety and what it looks like, and just kind of all the different reasons that contribute to it. So we'll move from there into more strategies, but as we talked about right before the break, in terms of the stages of grief, I put this in here because people always ask me if we were going to fit anxiety into the stage process, where would it go? And I sat and thought about it for a little while. And while I don't agree that these stages work in a linear fashion or that they are all of the stages, I do see anxiety come on sometimes right after a loss has occurred. I mean, within hours, days, someone is feeling this heightened anxiety. But often it's usually around the more first couple of months, because again, there's that shock and numbness and disbelief that can occur in the beginning of a loss that is so kind of disassociating and disconnecting from everything and from your own emotions that you may even really not be experiencing much anxiety initially. As the loss and the reality of it begins to sink in, the reality of all the ways that someone's world is changing, the secondary losses, the realization of who in your life and your world is supporting you in this loss. People are surprised sometimes to find a lack of support when they're grieving. And these, again, secondary losses keep occurring, and the grief is bigger than they thought it was going to be. It's extending even longer than they thought it would. And those are all contributing factors to anxiety coming on. So I wouldn't necessarily put it, if we were going to look at grief in a linear stage formula, in the very beginning, but maybe more towards the middle, and maybe replace it with bargaining, because bargaining is a kind of misunderstood one within this stage process. It works well when thinking about facing a terminal illness, but not as well in grief. That's more about that. Okay, so how do you work with anxious grief? Again, I really want you all to be thinking about this tandem approach. Clients coming in, getting to know their grief, getting to know their anxiety. It's really important. I've talked a bit about doing an anxiety inventory. This is something you could absolutely do on an intake form before you ever meet with a client. It's something you can do in session with someone, and it's something you can send home for homework. And also a grief inventory. So again, this tandem approach, you're going to do an anxiety inventory and a grief inventory. The grief inventory is, again, kind of really looking at how long, how much have they processed? What's their support system like? What was the relationship? What was the loss? Where do they feel blocked? What are they trying to do to assist themselves in grief? How is it impacting their identity? How is it affecting their spiritual or religious beliefs? Who's supporting them? Who's holding them back? So one of the big things I really like to do is, again, helping people track their anxiety. This is important, again, because so many of us will push away anxiety, and the last thing we want to do is get to know it. But getting to know it is a way to help us manage it. It also gives us a greater sense of control over it and less fear around it. When we have fear around anxiety, it just gets even bigger and we slam the door on it every time it comes. It manifests in those physical symptoms. It spills out in panic attacks. When we are able to approach the idea of the anxiety in a less fearful way, it doesn't impact us as much. Every time it comes up, whether it's physical symptoms presenting first or anxious thoughts that are popping up, we can start to develop and cultivate the ability to step back and say, oh, I'm having an anxious thought. Again, this idea that I spoke about earlier, where in grief, often the beginning of grief, the first thing we will think about when we wake up or when we open our eyes in the middle of the night is that my person is gone. With that one thought, there are so many cascading anxious thoughts that can come. How am I going to get through this? How am I going to live the rest of my life without them? I can't believe they died the way they did. I didn't get to say goodbye. I wish I could tell them this. How am I even going to go to that party or that wedding or go back to work or take care of my kids? Like there's just a cascade of anxious thoughts that will come right away. And a lot of them don't have easy answers or ready answers or answers we want. And so the anxiety just continues to perpetuate. If we can learn to start stepping away from it, we have that initial thought, my mom is dead. Take a breath, give yourself some self-compassion around it, step away. That's an anxious thought. I'm going to get up right now. I'm going to just sit and have coffee, put some blinders on. One of the things we do when we're in grief is we spend a lot of time in the past and a lot of time in the future. So we're thinking about everything that led up to that person's death, the relationship we had with them, everything that was going on prior to their death. And then we're thinking a lot about the future and what life is going to look like now that they're gone. We're spending very little time in the present moment. And so using basic techniques of meditation and mindfulness, just to bring yourself back periodically throughout the day to that mindful state where you're just existing in the present moment and not spinning out in these two places that don't exist right now is really helpful. But again, using like some kind of anxiety tracking journal. You can print this out if you want, having them write down the date, the location, where were they when when the anxiety came on, what time was it? Was there a trigger? What were the anxious thoughts that occurred? What were the emotions they felt with those thoughts? What were the symptoms they felt? And then what was the behavior that ensued? I'm always really impressed by how well this helps clients just begin to get to know it. They're often surprised by either how much anxiety they have and how frequently they're experiencing it, or they're surprised to notice that there are very real themes. They had maybe previously been so avoidant with their anxiety that they weren't even able to pinpoint that there were very specific themes coming up. There were very specific triggers. And so to begin to manage and cope with those. Looking at these triggers, making lists of social triggers, personal triggers, environmental, and then describing the symptoms that you feel for each one, describing the thoughts, and then coming up in session often with coping skills you can use when these triggers arise. Some of the just helping people come up with these basic plans for what's going to happen. Things that they do feel in control of can be helpful reminders, things that they're not in control of. Self-check-ins, I think, are really helpful for people in the beginning of their day even. How am I feeling today? What's my anxiety level? What do I have coming up today that might provoke anxiety, might trigger it? What can I do in those moments that's soothing? I have a lot of people who experience anxiety at work. Many of us cannot afford to take time off work when we go through even a very significant loss. And the sad truth in this country is there is very little bereavement leave. There are people really trying hard to change that, but as of now, there's very little bereavement leave and recognition for grief in the workplace. And so a lot of people are going back into the workplace really struggling. And how it often manifests is filling out anxiety. They're really afraid that they're going to feel overwhelmed by their grief during the day. They're afraid they're going to start crying or that they're just going to feel unable to work. And all of that causes anxiety. So one of the things that's really helpful to do is make space for that grief before work, during work, after work, whether it's journaling in the morning before you go to work, whether it's talking to a friend or a family member, having a session with a therapist, just doing something to make some space for the grief. And so that when they go into work, they're not carrying it right underneath the surface as much. They've maybe had a really good cry, or they've gotten out some anger, or if they've, worked through some of their guilt or written about it. And then they can do the same thing at work, maybe taking really scheduled breaks, maybe spending their lunch hour doing a session with a therapist or doing some of these other journaling techniques. And then again, after work too. Grief is funny. Often one of the biggest things we need to do with it is make space for it. And we don't often make space for it naturally. We're not inclined to because we're afraid of it. And then around us, our environment and our culture is not making that much space for our grief. So it's not naturally provided. We have to make space for it. Otherwise, it is going to spill out in this anxiety. These are more, coping sheets. These are all things that you can use with clients, helping them really start to look at the connection of anxious thoughts. What happens when they feel that thought, when they have that thought? Often there can be a physical symptom, an emotional reaction. So when they have an anxious thought, how am I going to cope with this loss? Something as simple as that. How am I going to do this? How am I going to be here with this person gone? So what does that trigger for them? What's the physical feeling that they have when that happens? Do they feel tightness? Do they feel, stomach nausea? Do they feel racing heart? Do they sweat? Do they feel dizzy? What are those physical symptoms? And then what are the emotions that come? Fear, sadness, anguish, yearning, rage. What are the feelings that are coming up with it? And then what do they do? So do they freeze? Do they run from it? Do they distract themselves? Do they have healthy, unhealthy coping mechanisms? Do they go for a nice walk? Do they exercise? Do they tell a friend? What is this chain of reactions that they have to an anxious thought? And so when you start to break it down into these really palatable ways for people to understand, then they can really start to work on it. They have the anxious thought. Okay, there's that anxious thought that I tend to have frequently, which is maybe in this case, how am I going to do this? How am I going to cope with this loss? And then they feel the physicality of it, and they can recognize that. They can have a moment of recognizing it, having some compassion. Those feelings start to arise, but then they can start to maybe step away from it. They can start to choose different behaviors, healthy coping tools. Again, going for a walk, journaling, talking to someone, having some kind of sensory experience, taking a shower, eating a piece of chocolate, just kind of moving away from the rabbit hole that they're going down in those anxious spirals. These are some more of the ideas to do. Meditating, I talk so much about in my work with clients, and I know meditating can be kind of eye-rolling, maybe not for therapists and clinicians, but for so many clients, especially when they're grieving, meditating just feels like overwhelming. It feels too hard, or it feels like annoying, or whatever it is. And sure, meditating is hard. It's hard for me to make time and space to do it. But even just a few minutes of it is so helpful. And my goal for clients who are anxious and grieving in terms of meditation isn't to reach some like perfect nirvana state where they're not having any thoughts. It's more about helping them begin to notice their thoughts. So you all know when we sit down to meditate, all the thoughts start to pop up. We're trying to get silent and reach that nice space where there's no thoughts popping up, but inevitably, we're like, oh, I got to go get almond milk at the store. Okay, I'm going to breathe some more. Oh, I got to pay that bill. Or I wonder if my friend is still mad at me, all these things. And when you practice being able to notice those thoughts and then step away from them and return to your calm state, that is what's really helpful in terms of anxious grief. Again, because we have these really intense thoughts that come in grief, and all of them, but they often produce anxiety. So helping clients really learn how to not follow down the rabbit hole of the anxious thoughts and the grief-based thoughts. Talking with them through all of their social anxieties, coming up with plans. I think one of the things that you really notice with people who are grieving is that their social landscape truly changes. grief has the amazing ability to really have you reevaluate what matters to you, who matters to you, what your relationships are, what your good relationships are. A significant loss will show you very quickly who shows up for you in your life, who doesn't, who is really there to support you and see you and hold you and validate your grief. And then often people will be really surprised by the people who don't show up, the people they thought that would show up who didn't. And sometimes the people they didn't ever imagine are the ones that who show up. All that to say, people really begin to go through a big reevaluation of their support system and their social network. What can they tolerate? They don't want to maybe necessarily go out like the way they used to, or maybe they lost a spouse or a partner and it's that person that they were always with and went to all their social functions with. Maybe they're feeling anxiety about how to talk about their loss, how to talk about their grief, or they don't know how to not talk about it. And they keep finding themselves in social situations where everyone's having shallow conversations or not acknowledging their loss, and they don't know how to do that. Really unpacking that with them, helping them understand how unfortunately normal it is to not feel supported or to feel scared in some of those different environments that once felt familiar. So really kind of having some good conversations about that, and then also strategizing who does feel good in your life. Who do you want to spend time with? Who can you seek out? Who can you ask for more support? How can you create it? Coping with intrusive, catastrophic, and negative thoughts. This is one of the most common symptoms I see of grief-related anxiety. It's the catastrophizing. People begin to really get stuck in a loop of catastrophizing about everything. And again, it's that yearning for control. This horrific, uncontrollable thing has happened in your life. Someone has died, even if they died of a long illness and it was something that was common for somebody to get, it doesn't matter that you can still, there's just the reminder of your mortality and the reminder that we can lose people and that our own bodies are fallible is really scary. And it just feels absolutely out of our control. And so we seek to control anything else we can. And that often shows up in this catastrophic thinking. We begin to see the world through a lens where something bad can happen at any moment. And so how can we think through all the worst case things that are going to happen? It becomes really addictive without even realizing that you're doing it. You're suddenly just thinking through worst case scenarios with everything. You can't relax until someone has made it home from work. If they're 5 minutes late, you're sure that they're dead in a car accident or something else terrible has happened. You start to think that that pain in your side is not that you're hungry, it's that you have cancer. Everything becomes just catastrophic. And these are some worksheets you can use with some of those. But really, I think that the thing to really think about and talk about with these catastrophic thoughts are that people are afraid to stop thinking about them. That's one of the things that I've noticed more than anything is they're really afraid to even start to do the work to step away from the catastrophic thoughts because it feels scary. It feels scary to trust in the world again. It feels scary to surrender to a place of not knowing. It feels much more like you're in control and you're doing something if you're worrying about it and overthinking it. It also helps to really do some self-compassion. I know that's like another eye-rolling one sometimes from clients or maybe even some of you clinicians, but it's a really big part of this work. When people have these catastrophic thoughts, having them start to really notice, okay, there's the catastrophic thought before they can go down that whole rabbit hole of playing out the terrible scenario that may happen or may have happened. Having them really stop and notice I'm having a catastrophic thought. That's a real catastrophic scenario I'm envisioning right there. And then going a step further and having them think, I'm having that catastrophic thought because I just lost somebody really important to me. And it was really hard and it was really scary. And having that moment of self-compassion, like this is not easy, what I'm going through, what I'm coping with. It's hard and it's scary and it's understandable that I'm feeling scared right now and want to control the situation. Helping them really talk to themselves through it, having some self-affirmations around that. It can stop that rabbit hole and that cycle of the catastrophic thoughts. Other things too can really help with catastrophic thoughts, basic things, distraction, really recognizing that you're having the catastrophic scenario, not allowing yourself to go down that rabbit hole, but instead pivoting, calling a friend, distracting yourself with something else, going for a walk, writing something down. I also work sometimes with clients on trying to play out like an opposite scenario. One of my health anxiety catastrophic thoughts was always that I will get cancer like my parents, and I have kids. And so I would get that pain in my side, like stomach stuff, whatever, our normal body things that you don't notice until you're in this anxious state. And I would immediately think, I have cancer. I'm going to die like my mom. Like, I'm not going to see my kids grow up. And I would be off in some scenario in my head within like seconds of having that one pain. And I would be picturing myself in a hospital bed dying and saying goodbye to my kids. And from there, that would just spiral me into more anxiety. And when I started to really work on this for myself, I would stop myself, I'd have the pain in my side. I would immediately think it's cancer, I'm dying. And then I would stop and I would recognize that's a catastrophic thought. Have a little compassion for myself. Claire, it's so understandable that you're having that thought. Your parents died of cancer. And then I would try to picture an opposite scenario. So instead of going to that hospital bed dying scenario, I would try to picture myself at one of my kids' weddings 20 years from now, and to do it with as much visceral detail as I would have with the catastrophic thought. And so it took a lot of work to do this. And sometimes it does take a lot of work. And I'll talk to clients about that. But when you can start to really take the steering control back from these catastrophic thoughts and steer them in a direction that's more helpful and calming and soothing and practical, it stops that just constant instant cycle that they're routing to all the time. But the catastrophic thoughts you will really, really find frequent with your anxious grieving clients. I think having some like basic affirmations are great too. When you have a client whose their anxiety is ramping up, or they're catastrophizing, or they're obsessing on health anxiety, or whatever's happening, to have them have like a list of mantras or affirmations that they can just start repeating instead of that anxious thought. So whatever the anxious thought is, I'm going to die, so-and-so is going to die, I'm going to get cancer, my kid's going to get in an accident if I let them out on the bike, whatever the catastrophic thought is, to replace it every single time when you notice yourself doing it, replace it with like, I'm okay, I am safe, I'm grieving, I'm doing the best I can. Have just these, affirmations that you repeat to yourself all the time, and really like replace the anxious thoughts with those. And it really begins to help. When we don't do that and we let these anxious thoughts run rampant, they get stronger and stronger and more powerful, and we route to them more automatically. Anxiety is insidious. It really grows. It's helpful to externalize anxiety and to really think about it as this thing that is with you and happening, and to move away from it and say, okay, there's the anxiety. Here's me, and I'm going to have some control over this, and I'm not going to let this overpower all the time, everything. But it takes a little work. And it's also, again, I'll reiterate, it's scary sometimes for people to take back that control over it. Health anxiety, I have been touching on, but this is one that you will really see again with anxious grieving clients. Here's an inventory to kind of work through with them. What are the anxious thoughts about illness and health? Often people have very specific ones. They may be related to the way their person died. They may not. They may just be whatever they came up with, or related to something else that they've experienced in their life. What do they do when they have these thoughts? So many people will hop on Google right away. They'll just Google pain in the back of my head. And there's a million things that could be, and things will pop up on their aneurysms and whatnot. And sometimes it's nothing. And they'll go down these rabbit holes, and they're checking, and they're trying to get their hands around it, control it, find the outcome of it. And really all they're doing is ramping up their anxiety more, feeding into the anxiety more, giving that anxiety control when they're doing that. And so starting to talk with them about, what would it be like if, when you get that pain in the back of your head, you don't look it up? How do you feel? What does that feel like if you don't go on Google right away when that happens? Talking through that with them, because almost always they'll tell you that they'll feel really scared well, what if I'm ignoring like a real symptom, like my mom had a glioblastoma and I'm really afraid that I'm going to ignore a symptom if I don't do that. And so coming up with like a practical plan for when is a symptom enough? What can you do to reach out for help when you have that? Even working with people to set timers, like you're allowed to think about health anxiety and stress about it and Google about it for 5 minutes once a day, and that's it. And that can be really helpful for people because then they'll know that they're going to have this time this afternoon when they get to sit and focus and stress about it. And so all the rest of the day, when those anxious thoughts pop up about their health anxiety, they can say, okay, not right now, but I'm going to do that at 2:30 for 5 minutes. And it's very effective. It's really helpful in terms of being able to start stepping away from it. And the moment they start to learn how to step away from it and not feed into it, it begins to diminish. So these are all kinds of questions you can look at in terms of the health anxiety. Where did it begin? Was it there before your loved one's death, or has it only been since then? Is pretty important to look at because there are some experiences that people may have that they've already been carrying health anxiety for a long time. The same exercises and strategies apply, but just kind of really trying to pinpoint where some of it originated is helpful. Another tracking sheet for that. Facing fears, a lot of times people are really just afraid to look at their biggest fears. So actually having them strategize and plan. Okay, so say the pain in your side is cancer. What is the first thing that you would do? Really walking through some of it. It can be scary. I recommend doing that kind of work in session, not sending it as homework. That may sound obvious, but really sitting with them in session and talking through, like, let's talk through some of like the actual things that you think you would have to do if you found out that was cancer and what that might look like. Even walking them all the way up to their own death in some scenarios, but doing it in session where you're really processing all the fear, all the sadness that's coming up for them. Again, scheduling time to worry, I think is a really helpful one. It just, again, helps them learn how to step away from those thoughts and give themselves a break from them. These are some looking at the core beliefs and challenging them. What evidence do I have that this belief is true? What evidence do I have that it's not true? And again, it's amazing how much resistance you'll see to doing these things. So sometimes you're really doing them in session and you're not sending these as homework. You're actually working through a lot of this in session because the person might feel a lot safer to talk through and explore relinquishing some of these fears and worries. Talking about death anxiety. We talked a little bit about talking to kids about grief and death and what they experience. And the sad truth is that we really shield and protect our children from death and grief. As a result, we ourselves don't know how to talk about it. We were those children who were protected and shielded from talking about death and grief. And so maybe we make it into adulthood before we experience a significant loss, but then there we have experienced it and we have no role models in our families. We didn't see anybody grieve because they shielded us from it and protected us from it. We haven't had conversations about death because no one wanted to talk about it out of, trying to protect somebody from it. And so kind of getting really open with your clients about talking about death and talking about their beliefs around it. You'll notice that a lot of people have anxiety about how their person died, whether they suffered at the end, what their physical experience of dying was like, what their physical experience of their illness was like. They're very hard conversations to have sometimes, but they're also really helpful to bring out into the open and out and to be able to say out loud. Sometimes people just need to say what they were afraid of or say what they thought might have happened for their person and be able to give voice to it, because otherwise they're carrying it around and tamping it down so much of the time that they haven't even let themselves really explore it. Well, I have so many conversations with clients about their beliefs about death and the afterlife. And I am open to going into any direction somebody wants to bring in. How we view what happens when we die does really greatly impact our grief process. There are some people who have very solid, devout beliefs about what happens when we die that are really comforting and helpful. And then there are some people who have no beliefs, or they haven't really thought about it, or some of their beliefs about what happens when we die are scary or punitive. Going into those places and helping them start to talk about it. It's often there's nobody else they're talking about it with, that there's not anybody who's willing to have those conversations or hold that space while they explore it for themselves. And so there's naturally a lot of fear around it. But being willing to just really hold that space, let them be curious, let them stumble through different feelings and answers and ideas, let them explore different places. It's helpful not only for their own anxiety around death, but also their feelings around what they perceive their person experienced. Coming up with anxiety coping plans. Anxiety, the thing about anxiety is it's really pretty basic and easy to work on. Most cognitive behavioral exercises will work with anxiety. It's just that you have to actually work on it. You have to be a little diligent. So whether you're working on it and being diligent session by session with someone, or hopefully they're also really being able to utilize these tools and exercises and work on it themselves between sessions, it really just requires starting to make an active choice to, when those anxious thoughts pop up, when the physical anxiety comes on, what are those healthy coping strategies they're going to use? Are they going to recognize those anxious thoughts? Are they going to choose healthy coping mechanisms? Are they going to choose to journal and to write down tracking sheets? Once they begin to do that, the anxiety becomes much less powerful, and it will come on. They'll maybe feel it. Some people may feel a certain level of over anxiety for all their lives, but it doesn't diminish. It doesn't debilitate them like it was maybe when they first come in to see you. I had a client who came in after losing a parent, and she was having anxiety attacks when she was in her car, and she was having anxiety attacks on airplanes. When we first started just really starting to talk about it, she had been so afraid to even look at any of it. When we just started to really talk about it, come up with plans, really break down the granular anxious thoughts she was having, break down that fear of loss of control, fear of death. Then when she would be in a car or an airplane, the anxiety would start to come on, those thoughts would start to bloom, and she was able to sit and be like, okay, I'm having some anxious thoughts. I understand why. Here's what I'm going to do right now. I'm going to journal. I'm going to breathe. I'm going to do my affirmations, or replace some of these anxious thoughts with positive self-talk. And then the anxiety would dissipate in many, many ways. It's when we let it run rampant, when we go down the rabbit holes, when we check things on Google, when we play out these catastrophic scenarios, that is when it becomes more and more insidious, more layered, deep-rooted. And so even just these small tools of working on it are so immensely helpful and powerful. Again, self-compassion is a big root of this. It's a really, really important part of working with grieving clients in general and anxiously grieving clients. We are so hard on ourselves when we're grieving. We're hard on ourselves in any vulnerable state, I think, whether we're experiencing a health issue, whether we're going through a divorce, or we've lost a job, or we've lost a loved one. We're so hard on ourselves. We beat ourselves up for not getting through it quicker, being better at it, bouncing back, all these things. And so helping your clients really take a step back and just start to be kind to themselves, start to recognize that they didn't ask for this thing. They didn't ask to lose somebody they loved so much. They didn't ask to be in the throes of so much sadness and anguish. They didn't ask to have that interrupt their work life and their relationships. And just to help them meet themselves where they are in that moment of self-compassion is really important. I'm going to skip through some of these because they're all in your handouts. And I'm sure, I hope a lot of you know about self-compassion exercises. It's always great to, when someone is beating themselves up about how long they've been grieving, or how the grief is going, or they haven't cleaned out their person's closet in 2 years still, or whatever it is. And just to say, like, what if a friend of yours told you the same scenario? What if they told you that they were really struggling to clean out their husband's closet because they missed him so much? Would you tell them that they were a mess, or would you be kind to them about it? And so just to kind of help normalize some of that for them. I know I'm skipping through some of this, but again, this is all in your handouts. So these are some of like the kind of big things that I outline in both my Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief book and the Anxious Grief Workbook. When I really sat down after I'd written that article about anxiety and grief, and I started getting all these emails and people coming in, and then I decided I really like this had to be addressed in a bigger way. And I wanted to write a book about it. And I thought, okay, how would I break this down? What are the ways that I really help clients through this stuff? And initially, a lot of it's hearing the story of loss. Again, some people really haven't processed their grief when they're coming in. Helping hold that space, bear witness to what they're going through, listen to their story of loss with compassion and openness and understanding, and just really meet them where they are, provide a space for their grief that has not presented itself otherwise. Their family hasn't held space for it, their friends, their culture, they themselves. So working on that piece, helping them make amends or work through guilt and regret. There's a lot, again, that goes on with so much guilt and regret. And I think that helping them just find ways to make amends and to even apologize, to reframe scenarios. I'll have a lot of my clients write letters to people that they love, and even just say all the stuff they wish they had said, say what they wish they had done. Of course, it's not the same. Of course, they want their person back here in the flesh. They want to make those amends in person. They want to do the thing over, but they're carrying this guilt and regret around all day. And there has to be a way to release it. And often I think energetically, we really do have the ability to move through some of this stuff in our bodies, in our minds, and our hearts. Helping them take inventory and evaluate their lives. Again, grief pares things down to their essence. What matters to you? What's important? What do you want to do now in this new landscape that is so unfamiliar, this life that you're going to live that you hadn't planned for without this person, carrying this grief through the rest of your days? What is that going to look like? How do you want to work through that? And how do you want to plan for it? Using writing. I love writing. I am a writer, and I always have been, but I still think it's just a really powerful tool, reminding people that they don't have to be a writer, write anything profound, or have written before in order to utilize writing. We're all writers. We can all use writing in order to heal. Having them journal, having them write letters to the person that they've lost, write letters to themselves, write angry letters to family members who were mean to them, or medical personnel who they feel wronged, their person. They don't have to send the letters to the people who are living, but just writing them and getting that stuff out. There's so much we can do. Poetry, writing, inhabiting your person and writing yourself a letter from them. There's just profound things we can do with writing. Retraining the brain is a lot of the cognitive behavioral stuff, coming up with those worksheets, replacing thoughts, recognizing catastrophic and negative thoughts, being present, finding that those ways to be really present in mindfulness and meditation, to move away from, constantly dwelling in the future that hasn't happened yet and constantly dwelling in the past, exploring their beliefs, their spirituality, how they hold and contextualize a death and an afterlife. There's a million ways to think about death and the afterlife, and just being open to whatever your client brings in, setting aside your personal bias and beliefs and, fears around that, and just being open to hold space for what they want to explore is really helpful. And then diving into death and talking about it, facing it, making plans around it. Sometimes helping somebody make their own end of life plans can alleviate some big anxiety around that. Helping them come up with how they want to die, what they want to leave behind. Do they need to have advanced directives, wills? All of that kind of stuff is really helpful actually in diminishing anxiety. Finding meaning. David Kessler talks a lot about meaning. His book is The Sixth Stage of Grief. We're both playing with those stages of grief, and his is Finding Meaning. And finding meaning is a really important part of grief. It's not something that people are often ready to think about in the beginning of a loss. It's sometimes the last thing people even want to consider. So it's an area that I tread into lightly, in particular with clients who are new to a loss. Finding meaning is the last thing you want to do after your child has just died, or you've lost the love of your life, or any significant loss. It's so hard to even think about finding meaning in that. But when I think about finding meaning, I think about that post-loss growth. I think about all the ways that grief changes us. I always say that grief asks a lot of us. It asks us to evaluate what matters to us, who matters to us, what is the life we want to live now. It also asks us to review all the choices we've made and who we've been up until this point, work through regrets and guilt and missed opportunities, think about how to move forward and learn lessons from those things and those places. Meaning also means honoring our person. There are many ways to honor the person that we lose. We can honor them in small, invisible ways every day, just acting in ways that embody their values, doing kind things for other people, making someone laugh because that's what our person was really good at doing, is a way of just staying connected to them and feeling that sense of honoring them. We can honor them in really big ways. We can continue work that they did, or we can start an organization, or really go into very large public ways of honoring people. But when we do that, in any capacity, when we honor someone, even just by lighting a candle and thinking of them, what we're doing is staying connected to them. And I think that when we are able to stay connected with someone, it alleviates that feeling of incongruence we experience in loss. And when we can alleviate that feeling of incongruence, we experience less anxiety. How are we supposed to go from a very close relationship with a significant person in our lives? Maybe we talk to them every day. Maybe we saw them every day. Maybe we slept in the same bed with them every night. How do we go from that kind of relationship to nothing at all, and make sense of that, or be able to live with that? It's so hard to do that. And this is what Continuing Bonds talks about, and what a lot of the grief literature has moved towards is, how do we maintain a sense of connection with our person? How do we find ways to continue to commune with them, talk to them, understand them, tell them about us and our lives? It doesn't have to be anything spiritual or religious. You don't have to believe in anything in particular. It can be as simple as just helping yourself begin to feel that continued sense of connection. I always give this example, but my mom's been gone for so long. She was a really forceful woman. She was passionate and fiery, and had a lot of opinions. And I always think, like, I knew her well enough and long enough that I could ask her like so many questions, and I know what her answer would be for most of them. I can hear her voice. I can imagine what side she would take to an argument, or an opinion she would have. I could ask her if she likes my outfit, and always know her answer. She loved fashion, and she would probably tell me that I should wear more color. And these things are still there, and they're still available, and we can still do this with our person. And in the beginning, it feels so hard. We just want them back here in the flesh. We want things to be the way they used to be. And it can feel so sad sometimes to begin to cultivate this other connection, this more ethereal connection, because it's not the relationship that you used to have. But once you begin to do it more often, and you get more used to it, and you cultivate that sense of connection, it does alleviate so much of that incongruence and anxiety that you're going to have to live the rest of your life without them. Yeah, so that was a long tangent. Post-loss growth. this is, the kind of growth we experience after a significant loss. Not everybody experiences post-loss growth. And this is also, again, a tricky thing to talk about with someone who's just gone through a loss, especially a horrific or complicated or violent loss, to think about or even consider that there's going to be positives or growth that comes from this. It's really hard for some people to come around to at first. And eventually, they may notice themselves, though, that they're coming around to different things that they feel good about. Maybe they've gained more compassion for the world. Maybe they have made changes to their life that they really needed to make, and the death spurred that on. Maybe they've figured out, who really matters to them, or they've gotten out of unhealthy relationships. There's a lot that can come in this ability to grow after a big loss. Post-traumatic growth is also in here with post-loss growth. I like what David Kessler says about finding meaning, that it's actually a decision that we have to make in grief. Are you willing to find meaning in time? Are you willing to let yourself live a little more? Am I willing to grow? Am I willing to live past this in a way that honors what I've lost? And again, that's not a decision that you need to make right away. But I see such a range of grieving clients. Some of my clients who come in, they come in like within the first few weeks after a loss, or I have some clients who are coming in 10, 15 years after a loss, or some like 1 or 2 years after a loss. And so they're always in different places in their grief. They're either in the throes of the beginning, where they're just navigating so much of the practical stuff. They're trying to, close up an estate, or they're arguing with family members about practical logistics for the memorial service, or they are, trying to figure out how they're going to support themselves with changes that have happened post-loss. The beginning is very overwhelming in terms of a lot of practical things that can happen. And then so many people I hear will often say that the second year of a significant loss is harder. You have all this buildup in the first year. You're just like getting through every anniversary, every birthday, every one of these kind of firsts that happen in that first year of loss. There's so many firsts. The first time you go on an airplane and don't text them when you land. The first time that someone doesn't realize your person is dead and you have to tell them. There's birthdays, and there's also the anniversary of when somebody got sick or when an accident happened. And then all the time you're leading up to this 1-year anniversary of the death itself. And I think that has a lot of anxiety that comes with it. You can't believe it's going to be a year. You can't believe you're headed up towards this anniversary date. It's the longest you've gone maybe without talking to them or seeing them. And then you get there and you get through the 1 year, and you realize that there's still a lifetime ahead of more of this. It almost feels like if you can just get through that first year and get through all these really hard things, that you'll be okay, or you won't have to grieve anymore. And then instead you realize that you're going to have to keep doing it year after year. So there's a lot of heaviness and sadness that can come in that second and third year. And so I often will find a lot of clients will find me in that time because they're surprised that they're still it's even heavier, or they're surprised that they're still grappling with it so much. They thought that they got through that first year, they would be feeling good, and now they aren't. And so they're seeking support. Or I'm seeing clients who, like I said earlier, lost a parent or somebody significant in childhood and adolescence, and they're only now at a place of maturity and development where they're able to really understand it on a full, broad spectrum, and they want to talk about it. They want to explore oh my God, I can't believe these were the ramifications. And this is what I was like at 16 because this had happened. And I made this choice to do this because that happened. And they want to explore all the layers and ripple effect of a loss that happened many years ago. I'll also see in a lot of clients who come carrying an old loss, they'll realize that their anxiety started years ago. They'll come in and they'll think that they were just always an anxious person. Oh, I've always been an anxious person. And then we'll go start looking back, and we'll realize that the anxiety actually is tied to the loss that they experienced when they were 14 or 20 or something. And they weren't always an anxious person. They've been carrying this anxiety, this grief-related anxiety for a long time and have never tried to work on any of it. These are some more finding meaning exercises. Okay, well, I've left a good amount of time then for some questions because I really wanted to get back to a lot of your questions. But I will say, I'm really honored that so many of you showed up to this presentation, because I think this is a really important component of grief. And I think we're going to see more and more of it in coming years. I think people are kind of recognizing their own grief more often. The pandemic gave us a really amazing shift in terms of our ability to just recognize all the different ways we grieve and all the different kinds of grief and all the different things we grieve for. I think pre-pandemic, we wrote grief off as had to be the loss of a significant person. And now we realize all the different ways we grieve. It's like what's happened with trauma recently when we reserved PTSD for like war veterans and car accidents. And now we realize that we can experience so much trauma and so many iterations of trauma throughout our lives, and that so many of us carry trauma. And I think we're having a similar thing about grief and really realizing how important it is to embrace it. And with that comes the realization that we've grappled with a lot of anxiety within our grief, and we've tamped it down, or we've tried to hide it away or not address it. And it's just continuing to linger and maybe even become exacerbated. And then that anxiety is constantly triggered by all the things that are going on in this world right now. And so I think that we'll see a lot more of this. And I really hope that as clinicians, you really are open to recognizing it, seeing it, helping your clients really start to have that basic foundational understanding of what grief is and why it's important to lean into it, and how the leaning into it and the understanding it and exploring it is what's going to help them actually process and heal from it and learn how to live with it. And so I just really appreciate all of you being here. And I'll move into Q&A. Please feel free to find me in any capacity. I'm online all over the place. Claire Bidwell Smith, books and whatnot. And you can always just send me a message. And again, Kubler-Ross's stages might be outdated, and some people think they might be harmful, but I think Elizabeth Kubler-Ross herself was pretty outstanding in the work she did. And I love this quote: the most beautiful people we have known are those who have known defeat, known suffering, known struggle, known loss, and have found their way out of the depths. These persons have an appreciation, a sensitivity, and an understanding of life that fills them with compassion, gentleness, and a deep loving concern. Beautiful people do not just happen. So with that, I will go into the question area. Sid, did you want to help me with any questions, or?
I sure could.
Okay, great. I got a little overwhelmed trying to go through them all.
Right. I'm just going to go and ask the highest upvoted ones first. Diane asks, some trauma therapists like Frank Anderson have suggested that taking anxiety medication like Xanax or Klonopin during acute traumas can actually exacerbate the healing process from trauma. Can you comment on your experience of medicating acute loss/trauma?
Yeah, I am not a psychiatrist, so I don't feel fully qualified to make this call, but I do think that there are absolutely times when some of these medications are necessary when someone is unable to function or needs some kind of stabilizing that we just aren't going to be able to provide to them in certain moments. I don't think long-term that these are the answer at all. I think that traumas and anxiety and grief must be processed on multiple levels, and that taking these medications, while they can be really helpful in a crisis moment, don't help long-term because they don't actually address any of the trauma or the anxiety that people need to heal from.
All right. Suzanne asks, can you discuss the connection between guilt and complicated guilt? Example, not being able to save their loved one, and how to help clients who get stuck in this area.
Yeah, I think that stuck is the important word here. People get very stuck in guilt. And one of the things that's really interesting that I have found about this is that people often will get stuck in guilt and cling to guilt as a way of staying close to their person. There is some guilt that is really warranted, and there are things that have happened that could have been preventable, or that perhaps your client may have had a hand in, unfortunately. And there are some things that are just really hard that have to be talked through and processed and can't be undone. Forgiveness is a piece of that. Self-compassion is a piece of that. And then there are times when we attribute guilt to things that couldn't have been prevented or couldn't have been different, or that we really didn't have a part in, but we're now attaching guilt to it. And sometimes that is because we feel like if we are to let go of the guilt, we're letting go of our person. It can feel like guilt is a way of honoring our person. I'll often ask someone, if you woke up and you weren't feeling guilty, what would that suddenly feel like? And it can feel scary to somebody. It can feel like if they let go of this guilt, if they no longer feel guilty, then that means they don't care that their person died or that they're over it. And so really working with them and talking and reminding them that there are different ways to hold on to the people that we love. And there are different ways to honor them than holding on to guilt, which is such a heavy and unhealthy experience. So I think that that's an interesting component of guilt. It's something to really watch for, that some people really get stuck in it and hold on to it just as a way of feeling afraid to step out of their grief.
Okay. Dana asks, do you have thoughts on medical providers wanting to prescribe SSRIs for patients experiencing depression and anxiety directly following a loss? I work in a medical facility, and they often turn to this as the first line of treatment for grieving patients.
I see this all the time too. I think it's a go-to for doctors, general practitioners, primary care providers. I think that a person comes in and says, I just lost my spouse, I'm a mess. They provide them with something, and it's not the answer, I don't think. I think they can be helpful, again, if someone really needs stabilization temporarily for a period of time, if they are really debilitated and unable to function in a way that allows them to work through some of the grief. Like if they can't actually get themselves into therapy or get support that they need, antidepressants can be helpful in some of those moments, but long-term, they're not going to be helpful. But the reason that this happens, again, is because even our medical doctors in this country are not trained to talk about death and dying or grief. It is not a required course in med school, you guys. It's not required. It's not required in med school. It's not required for nurses. It's not required to know what to do with a grieving person. And so this happens so frequently that primary care physicians will just prescribe these antidepressants and SSRIs just because they don't know what else to do or say. And it infuriates me because I don't think that most people actually need them when they're having pretty typical grief. They need support, they need understanding, they need space to talk about it, but they don't necessarily need medication.
All right, Lori asks, I'm an addiction therapist. My clients in early recovery or considering recovery rather, grieve their drug and drink of choice. This is always accompanied by anxiety. Can you speak to this form of anxious grief?
That's so interesting. I can totally imagine that. I think that grief is really valid, and it's such a part of their identity too. They're grieving who they used to be. They're grieving this thing that they felt they could rely on to help them through their struggles. And I think that there is anxiety that must accompany that in just the shift in identity, the shift in not having that that coping method that they relied on for so long, and not having, you know, a lot of trust and faith in what they're going to turn to now in the beginning. So all the anxiety that comes with just the uncertainty of taking that new path, it's exciting to think about, but it's also really, it's so understandable that they would feel that grief and that anxiety in that space.
All right. Tara asks, as a clinician, are there any tips if we start to be triggered with anxiety during a session?
Yeah, I think that that's an important question, and it applies for getting triggered for grief as well, and feeling overwhelmed at all when you are in a session and you're hearing these stories of loss or hearing so much anxiety. I think that we can experience some secondary trauma in some of this work. I hear horrific stories day in and day out about deaths. Some of them are really hard to sit with. They're hard to go home with. They wake me up in the middle of the night. A lot of the work that I have been doing all these years does cause me anxiety, not necessarily in session, but, you know, in my work as someone who only sees grieving clients, the fatality rate in my work is 100%. There's never a story where somebody lives. Every story I hear is a story of a death. No one survives a car accident. Nobody survives cancer. Nobody survives a suicide attempt. Every story ends in a death. And so I begin to see the world through that lens, right? I'll hear about a friend of mine will get cancer or something, and I'll think, oh, they're going to die, because that's only ever what happens. So there's that kind of anxiety that can come on. There's the anxiety of not feeling like you know how to help this person. I think that's a normal anxiety for all therapists and clinicians to experience. And it can definitely happen in grief as well. Grief is one of those things that's not fixable. There's not a lot of concrete, ready solutions all the time for grief. Grief is about holding space. It's about bearing witness. It's about validating. And so often it really requires sitting with someone's pure sorrow that you can't fix. And you're just sitting and holding that space for their sorrow and anguish. And that can be really hard. That itself can cause anxiety. I try to do a lot in my own life to just take care of myself, kind of expand on myself in all the ways I talk about in this when working with other clients. Do a lot of meditation and mindfulness, check in with myself about overwhelm and what my big questions are. It's hard to do this work too and not really think a lot about death and why we're here and what happens when we're gone and why certain people live certain lives. So I definitely have a spiritual realm to my own life that I have to tend to in order to do this work that I'm always exploring. And then I think learning too, I think constantly, which is what you guys are all doing here, which I love, continuing to learn. It's our understandings of humanity in general are just changing all the time. And so always being open to learning, never assuming that you're done, you know everything there is to know about grief or anxiety. There is always more to learn. But I think in a session, experiencing anxiety, I think doing your best to kind of get through it. Obviously, if you're having a full-blown panic attack, you might have to stop a session. And most importantly, afterwards, if you make it through a session, okay, really checking in with yourself about that anxiety. Why is that coming up? Is it something about this case, this client, this topic that is triggering for you? Is it ethically okay for you to continue seeing them if you are experiencing this much anxiety? We're all going to have clients that trigger us and stories of loss that are really hard to sit with. I think a lot of people who come into working in grief have experienced their own grief. And that said, we may have clients that come to us who had a loss so similar to ours that it's very triggering, or there's something else about it that's overwhelming. Being real with yourself, referring out, talking to colleagues, getting support. We're not perfect. We're humans, and we should experience reactions and emotions to this work, and we should have feelings about it. I don't think it would be responsible if we didn't. So just really checking in with yourself about everything that comes up for you when you're in this space.
So many thumbs up, so many hearts. This next attendee is channeling their inner Bessel van der Kolk. She asks, can anxiety-related grief turn into intergenerational trauma passed on?
That is good stuff. That's a great question. I'm going to guess yes, but I don't know for sure. And I haven't read enough about it. But I think generational trauma is fascinating. And I think that we all carry so much. I think I've seen a lot of clients who had a parent who maybe had lost a parent, had gone through a significant loss, and that parent parented them in a really anxious way that in turn has created a lot of anxiety for them. And their parent was experiencing grief related anxiety and put that anxiety on my client. And now they're coming in with their own loss and it's bloomed into that grief related anxiety. So I think I think you can definitely pass it on. And I also think about, there was a study with mice and cherry blossoms. I can't remember where this was, but they like shocked the mice at the scent of cherry blossoms. And it was something like 3 generations of mice later, they would just spray the scent of cherry blossoms and the mice would react in the same way that the ones who were being shocked would. So I think, just looking at some of that research is pretty powerful and profound. And I would imagine that there can be an intergenerational component of grief-related anxiety.
All right. Can you make suggestions on skills that will help someone with grief over losing several loved ones back in their country of origin, having not seen them in years, so they could not say goodbye or visit their gravesite?
Yeah. I think that really honoring that grief, recognizing it. I think sometimes we feel like maybe we shouldn't be allowed to experience a lot of grief in these cases because we haven't seen them or we hadn't been there, or we feel guilty about that. So first and foremost, really letting yourself feel that grief and honor it. And then I think having your own rituals is really important. And this is what we saw during the pandemic. There were so many people who could not rely on their typical rituals used in grief after the loss of a loved one. We couldn't have funerals. We couldn't sit Shiva. We couldn't have memorials. There were so many ways in which people were prevented from doing these really important rituals. And it's no different if someone is in a different country and you can't be there. You can have your own ritual. You can make up anything you want to do. You can have your own memorial service. You can light candles. You can say things. You can write things. And I think it's really important to do so. I think that I think closure in grief is a myth. I don't think we ever get closure, but I think that we can, again, come around to this idea of meaning, of honoring someone, of honoring our own grief for them, the relationship, the lineage, ancestors. I mean, I think just getting really in tune with yourself, what would feel good to do? What is a way you can ritualize them? It's never too late to do that. Someone could have died 10 years ago and you could just find out about it. And still you could have your own private memorial service for them. You could just come up with something creative that feels meaningful and honoring. So I think that that's the important thing to do.
We're getting so many comments about people being appreciative of the Q&A here. This next one hits home with me a little bit. What would you say to someone who has anticipatory grief related to their parents who aren't terminal, just simply the fear of them dying in general?
I'm hearing this more and more from my peers. It's interesting. I'm 45 now, and a lot of my peers are starting to lose parents or have their parents decline. And it's, I lost mine so young that it's a different experience for me, but it's been interesting to watch them. And there is a lot of that anticipatory grief, even if their parents aren't terminal, just thinking about how they won't be here forever. And I think really like recognizing why that feels scary, and, why that feels scary is because you love them. You can't imagine them not being here. Everything, their whole relationship you've had, the ways your identity is tied to them, what it will be like when they're gone. There's a lot to anticipate that could be scary. Have conversations with them. I can't say this enough. Talk to them about it. Make plans. Tell them all the things that you want to tell them before they die, even if they're healthy and there's no signs of them going anywhere. Tell them everything you really want to tell them now. Write them letters, sit down, come up, plan, do all the death planning, have all the conversations that you don't, so you don't have to have them in these scrambled last minutes when someone suddenly gets sick or breaks a hip or dies out of nowhere. You've actually had these beautiful conversations, you've prepared for things, you've said things that are important to you to say, and you've also made preparations. So much of it is fear. We're just really afraid to talk about this stuff. But once we start to sit down and unpack it, it feels so much better, especially when we can make those preparations.
Oh, that's great. Kimberly asks, what's one immediate skill or tool or intervention that comes to the top of your mind that you might use for panic and emotional spiraling of anxiety to get a client grounded?
Just breathing is the first go-to. It always is. When we're panicking and feeling that anxiety, we really start to take those quick, shallow breaths, and that keeps our body in this heightened state of alert. So your whole body just starts to go on alarm. When you can start to just breathe slowly, deeply, do that box breathing, sends a whole message to your nervous system that you're safe, that you're okay. And then when your whole body starts to calm down and ground, your thoughts slow down, you're able to start to harness the thoughts from there, make more rational decisions, step away from some of those anxious thoughts. It really starts with that breathing. It is the best thing you can do in that moment. If you're on an airplane and you're having a panic attack, starting to just breathe, slow down your breath, get control of that there, calms your whole body down and really allows you to start to get grounded.
You may have time for one or two more here. Please discuss prolonged grief disorder and its connection to depression and anxiety. I have a client who's mourning his wife's death from 3 years ago. Thank you very much.
Yeah, prolonged grief disorder, complicated grief. They're griefs that have a lot of layers and a lot of stuff that's not processed. It's hard to pinpoint something exactly because there's so many different components that can lead to both of them. The type of death, suicide, addiction, traumatic illness, something that was really difficult about the death itself can lend itself very easily and quickly to complicated and prolonged grief. The relationship the person had, maybe they were overly attached in some way. Maybe they were estranged. Maybe the relationship was abusive. There are so many different components of the relationship that are going to affect the grief process. And then there's things like guilt, and whatever involvement somebody may have had with the person's caretaking or death themselves. And so all of those things, and then also their life, so if you're looking at a client, I think they said the client wasn't an elderly client, maybe looking at their life, what's their support system? What do they have? What do they have going forward to look forward to? What do they have that fills up their life? And, are they lonely? Are they often alone? All of these things, like how are you supposed to move through and be able to hold your grief in a healthy and easier way if you've got all those layers on it, right? So you've got to start pulling apart all of those layers, really looking at the different layers for somebody, helping them understand the different layers, helping them process trauma, helping them move through some guilt, helping them look at resilient coping tools for moving forward in their life. I think prolonged and complicated grief are far more common than most people realize. I think that it's also treatable, it's also really, again, we have to help people lean into grief. We have to make space for it. We have to help people understand it. When we're not making space for it, when we don't get it, when we're running away from it, it's going to stay complicated and it's going to stay prolonged. So when we can really start to help people heal, there is a lot that can be done.
All right, we have time for one last question. Lori asks, from an evolutionary perspective, what do you think the purpose of our reactions, physiological and emotional, are to grief? Or two
Wow,
grief
that's a
are?
big question. Thanks, Sid. Throw that one at me right at the end. An evolutionary process. I don't know about in terms of how we evolve with grief, but I think that grief is such a necessary reaction to a significant relationship, to losing something and someone that we love. I think it's a way of moving through change, of parting with someone. When you go through a really significant loss, there's a period in the beginning where you feel this like severing of the physical relationship. It's so overwhelming. You can feel time getting farther away from that person. You can feel like their voice is fading. You can't remember what their hair felt like. There's this physical severing that is so overwhelming in the beginning. And I think there's a very real natural reaction we have to have in order to move through that, in which we feel the emotional effects of it. We feel the physical impacts of it. We see the life changes as a result. And then when we can start to really get through that and have those changes, we do come to a place where we can hold that grief and hold that space and recognize that physical severing and move into a place of more emotional connection with them. That's a very weird answer to that question. And on an evolutionary standpoint, I'm not sure. I'm going to let you guys figure that out. But I do believe, I'll just say last, I think grief is a beautiful human process that is a innate part of being a human, and that it serves us in many beautiful ways, and it asks a lot of us.
That's all we have time for.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'm going to conclude the session now.
Thank you. Thanks.